Welcome back to another journey into the world of Family Guy lore, where we slow down, dim the noise, and let the stories carry us gently into sleep. Tonight we'll uncover hidden secrets, forgotten histories, and the shadows beneath Quahog, told in a way that soothes as much as it intrigues. Quahog, at first glance, looks like any small coastal town you might drive past on a long journey. It has its cluster of homes, its unassuming main street, and that familiar mix of the ordinary and the odd. Yet when we look closer, beneath the laughter and the cutaway gags, the place begins to reveal something stranger, something older, and something a little haunted. Tonight we slow down and drift back, not into the life of one character, but into the town itself, because Quahog has always been more than just a backdrop. It is a character, a stage, and in many ways a spirit that lingers across every Family Guy episode. The origins of Quahog are wrapped in playful mystery. The show never offers a definitive account of its founding, but hints scatter through the episodes like loose breadcrumbs. A name like Quahog carries with it an echo of something ancient. In reality, a quahog is a hard-shelled clam, a creature pulled from the cold Atlantic waters, rooted in New England tradition. But when applied to this fictional town, the name feels almost ceremonial, as if chosen by unseen forces, binding the town's identity to the ocean and to secrets buried beneath the waves. Imagine the coastline long before Peter Griffin stumbled into drunken antics, long before the drunken clam became a landmark of mischief. Picture a dark, rocky shore where settlers once stood, carving out a life in a place where storms were frequent and the ocean gave little mercy. These early whispers of Quahog carry a mood of survival, a people building something in a place that never promised comfort. And in that foundation lies the first seed of eeriness. For towns born from hardship often inherit an atmosphere of restlessness. Family Guy, though a comedy, often nods to this kind of restlessness. Background gags show odd buildings, strange ruins, or neglected corners of town that the characters rarely question. The joke is in the absurdity, but when we sit with it, when we allow ourselves to imagine, these visuals take on a more haunting quality. What kind of town casually carries so many abandoned places, boarded-up shops, or empty lots? Why does Quahog, unlike other animated towns, feel both lived in and forgotten at the same time? Part of that answer lies in how the show positions Quahog as a mix of Americana and parody. The architecture blends small-town New England charm with sudden glimpses of the bizarre. Churches appear, graveyards linger just off-screen, and the characters walk past old monuments without pausing to explain them. It is as if the town itself refuses to reveal all of its history, holding its darker moments just out of reach. This is what makes Quahog feel haunted, not by traditional ghosts, but by the sense that something happened here before, and that it left behind invisible fingerprints. When we think of Quahog's identity, we inevitably arrive at the drunken clam, the bar that functions as the heartbeat of the town's social life. Yet even the clam feels like a relic, with its dim lighting, nautical decor, and weathered walls. It is a place that could easily be hundreds of years old, passed from owner to owner, standing against time like a stubborn witness. In some ways, it represents Quahog itself, a gathering place for laughter, yet built on shadows of the past. And then there are the graveyards. Few towns in animation casually display as many tombstones as Quahog does. The show often uses them for humor, but when you string together the appearances, they paint a picture of a place obsessed with mortality. Headstones pop up in cutaways behind houses, even in public spaces. They remind us, subtly and constantly, that death and remembrance are stitched into the town's fabric. It is as if the creators want us to laugh, but also to absorb the unspoken truth. The Quahog is a town that never forgets its dead. Think of Spooner Street, the quiet suburban lane where the Griffins live. On the surface, it's cozy, lined with pastel houses and trimmed lawns. But in the framing of certain episodes, when the street falls into shadow, it feels eerily empty. The houses stand too still, the lawns too quiet, and the road stretches out like something waiting to be traveled but never leading anywhere. It's a familiar trick of animation, the still background, but in Quahog, that stillness begins to feel uncanny, as though the town itself is watching its residents, recording every misstep. Even the name Spooner Street has a ghostly charm to it. A spoonerism is a playful flip of words, a linguistic trick. Naming the Griffins' home street after such a quirk suggests that from the very ground up, Quahog is built on inversion, on twisting reality into something absurd and often unsettling. The comedy here carries with it the faint chill of something warped, as though the town thrives not just on storytelling, but on distortion. As we drift deeper into the town's origins, we also notice the ocean's constant presence. Quahog is not just coastal, it feels tethered to the sea. The harbor appears again and again. Fishing boats dot the waters, and storms crash onto its shores with a frequency that feels symbolic. In many mythologies, the sea represents the unknown, the unconscious, the deep reservoir of fears and secrets. For Quahog, the ocean is both lifeline and threat, a provider and a taker. If the town is haunted, then much of that haunting comes from the waves, from the things washed ashore and the things pulled back out into the abyss. And within the sea-bound mystery, we find another thread, the clam itself. The Quahog clam, symbol of the town, carries an almost folkloric weight. It is hard-shelled, difficult to open, hiding its treasure deep inside. How fitting that the town named after it behaves the same way. Quahog is a clam of secrets, closing itself tightly, revealing only glimpses of what lies beneath. The townspeople go about their lives unaware or uncaring, but the clam holds it all, every forgotten tragedy, every half-remembered legend, every echo of those who came before. In this way, Quahog becomes less a comedy backdrop and more a stage set with haunted props. Every lamppost, every alley, every crooked sign is part of the architecture of unease. We laugh at the characters, but we also feel, deep down, that something about the place itself is off. It is a town that looks ordinary until you stare at it too long, and then you notice the cracks, the silences, the shadows that last a little too long. And perhaps this is the brilliance of Quahog. By never fully explaining itself, by always hinting but never confirming, the town becomes a perfect haunted character. It is the ghost in the room, the background voice we can't quite hear, the presence that lingers when the cutaway gag ends and the screen fades to black. It is built on shadows, sustained by secrets, and it waits quietly for anyone curious enough to notice. The silence of Quahog, the kind that rests over streets long after midnight, always feels heavier than it should. There is something about this town that makes the stillness linger just a little longer, as if the quiet itself carries a story, one waiting to be told. For those who know Quahog only from laughter and chaos, from the Griffin family and their wild misadventures, there's an unseen side to it, a side that creeps out from the edges when the streetlights flicker and the voices fade into whispers. Tonight we take a step deeper into that shadowed side, into the hidden heartbeat of a town that carries its own legends, its own ghosts. Every town has them, of course, unwritten tales, buried memories, and the sort of moments people don't put into polite conversation. But Quahog seems to gather them more eagerly than most, as though it was built on a foundation that attracts secrets. The houses here, with their cartoon-perfect outlines and pastel colors, carry an odd duality. They are welcoming in the daylight, inviting in their simplicity, yet at night they lean into the uncanny, their shapes casting shadows too sharp, their windows looking back at you like eyes that never blink. Chapter 1 begins not in a house, but on the shoreline. Narratively, Quahog has always been a port town, its coastline brushing up against the restless Atlantic waters. The beach is often seen in daytime scenes, with Peter and his friends sitting in lawn chairs or local kids wandering around with frisbees. Yet at night, the waves change their tune. They no longer feel playful or refreshing, but instead pull the air heavy with rhythm, like a constant heartbeat of the ocean. If you've ever stood there in the middle of the night, the tide rolling in, you'd swear you hear more than just water. Voices carry on the wind, half-formed, stretched too thin, murmurs that never fully resolve into language. These whispers, some locals say, belong to sailors who once docked here centuries ago. Before the cartoon simplicity of Quahog, before the town was drawn into existence, the coast was a site of shipwrecks and storms. Wooden vessels crashed into the rocks offshore, leaving fragments of stories scattered across the seabed. The legends suggest that not all the sailors left the sea when their bodies did. Some remained bound to the coast, forever retelling their last voyages in fragments of words that leak through the waves. But it isn't only voices that haunt the coast. People talk of shapes that move where no footprints follow. The sand shifts in patterns like steps, and the air grows colder without warning. Sometimes a figure can be glimpsed at the edge of vision, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the outline of a coat, staring out into the endless ocean. Blink, and it's gone. Stare too long, and the waves seem to pull you forward as if to join him. Of course, the Griffins have wandered these sands more times than they could count. Peter with his clumsy antics, Brian with his philosophical musings, Stewie with his endless curiosity. But the beach is not always so light-hearted. There was once an evening late in the series when Brian and Stewie walked the shore alone, discussing life, death, and the strange emptiness that sometimes finds them. What the episode never showed, but what the lore whispers, is that the silence after their conversation lingered. The waves rolled louder, the air grew colder, and Stewie, for a brief second, stopped walking and looked out into the dark. He claimed he saw someone standing there. Brian dismissed it, insisting it was a trick of the night. Yet Stewie, unusually quiet, walked home without another word. It's these subtle, almost hidden moments that create the impression Quahog is more than it seems. The shoreline isn't just a backdrop. It's the first threshold, the edge of the town where whispers gather and stories wait. And when you trace the streets back from the coast, the town itself feels alive, its neighborhoods shifting in tone with each passing block. Let's wander inward, then, towards Spooner Street, where the Griffin house rests in its familiar spot. In daylight, it's iconic, the yellow siding and green roof shining in the sun. At night, though, its charm transforms. The windows seem too square, the door too centered, and the shadows along the porch stretch too far into the street. Many who have studied Quahog's design, the way the show frames its buildings, notice that at night, the streets feel wide but empty, as if the town itself expands into something unnervingly hollow. Imagine walking down Spooner Street alone, no laughter, no voices, no cars, just rows of houses with their cartoon-perfect geometry, Every home looks the same, but when the moonlight falls at just the right angle, it feels as though some houses lean closer, watching you pass. One porch light flickers, another window curtain shifts when no one's inside, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. Not Brian, not any named character, but a sound that vanishes as soon as you notice it. This feeling intensifies with Quahog's other landmarks. The drunken clam, so often filled with noise, is utterly still at closing time. Its sign creaks in the wind, the neon light dimming in a pulse that feels almost like breathing. The playground nearby, where local kids play in daytime cutaways, looks like a skeleton in the dark. Swings swaying, though no breeze moves, a merry-go-round turning just enough to make the sound of rust on metal pierce the silence. This is where the heart of Chapter 1 rests, in the idea that Quahog itself is not just a setting, but a presence, a character silently threading through the lives of the people who live there. It has its bright moments, its cartoon humor, its satirical edge, but beneath all of that lies a town with a pulse, a whisper, a history that never quite sleeps. What gives this chapter its haunted energy is the way familiarity turns uncanny. The viewer knows these houses, these streets, this bar, this playground. They've seen them 100 times in jokes and cutaways. Yet by leaning into the absence of life, into the strange silence of these locations, they transform into places where anything could be hiding. A curtain's twitch could be a joke in daylight, but at night it feels like a ghost. The clam's neon sign is silly during happy hour, but in silence it's ominous. The playground is joyful with kids, but empty it becomes unsettling. By the end of this opening chapter, one thing becomes clear. Quahog is alive in more ways than one. Its streets breathe, its shoreline whispers, its landmarks wait in silence. And while the Griffin family continues their antics on the surface, there is something older, deeper and darker humming beneath their hometown. That hum is what Chapter 2 will begin to unravel. The satire, the cynicism, and the voices that Brian himself so often channels, perhaps without ever realizing that Quahog had been speaking through him all along. The silence of Quahog, the kind that rests over streets long after midnight, always feels heavier than it should. There is something about this town that makes the stillness linger just a little longer, as if the quiet itself carries a story, one waiting to be told. For those who know Quahog only from laughter and chaos, from the Griffin family and their wild misadventures, there's an unseen side to it, a side that creeps out from the edges when the streetlights flicker and the voices fade into whispers. Tonight we take a step deeper into that shadowed side, into the hidden heartbeat of a town that carries its own legends, its own ghosts. Every town has them, of course, unwritten tales, buried memories, and the sort of moments people don't put into polite conversation. But Quahog seems to gather them more eagerly than most, as though it was built on a foundation that attracts secrets. The houses here, with their cartoon-perfect outlines and pastel colors, carry an odd duality. They are welcoming in the daylight, inviting in their simplicity, yet at night they lean into the uncanny, the shapes casting shadows too sharp, their windows looking back at you like eyes that never blink. Chapter 1 begins not in a house, but on the shoreline. Narratively, Quahog has always been a port town, its coastline brushing up against the restless Atlantic waters. The beach is often seen in daytime scenes, with Peter and his friends sitting in lawn chairs or local kids wandering around with frisbees. Yet at night, the waves change their tune. They no longer feel playful or refreshing, but instead pull the air heavy with rhythm, like a constant heartbeat of the ocean. If you've ever stood there in the middle of the night, the tide rolling in, you'd swear you hear more than just water. Voices carry on the wind, half-formed, stretched too thin, murmurs that never fully resolve into language. These whispers, some locals say, belong to sailors who once docked here centuries ago, before the cartoon simplicity of Quahog. Before the town was drawn into existence, the coast was a site of shipwrecks and storms. Wooden vessels crashed into the rocks offshore, leaving fragments of stories scattered across the seabed. The legends suggest that not all the sailors left the sea when their bodies did. Some remained bound to the coast, forever retelling their last voyages in fragments of words that leak through the waves. But it isn't only voices that haunt the coast. People talk of shapes that move where no footprints follow. The sand shifts in patterns like steps, and the air grows colder without warning. Sometimes a figure can be glimpsed at the edge of vision, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the outline of a coat, staring out into the endless ocean. Blink, and it's gone. Stare too long, and the waves seem to pull you forward as if to join him. Of course, the Griffins have wandered these sands more times than they could count. Peter with his clumsy antics, Brian with his philosophical musings, Stewie with his endless curiosity. But the beach is not always so light-hearted. There was once an evening, late in the series, when Brian and Stewie walked the shore alone, discussing life, death, and the strange emptiness that sometimes finds them. What the episode never showed, but what the lore whispers, is that the silence after their conversation lingered. The waves rolled louder, the air grew colder, and Stewie, for a brief second, stopped walking and looked out into the dark. He claimed he saw someone standing there. Brian dismissed it, insisting it was a trick of the night. Yet Stewie, unusually quiet, walked home without another word. It's these subtle, almost hidden moments that create the impression Quahog is more than it seems. The shoreline isn't just a backdrop, it's the first threshold, the edge of the town where whispers gather and stories wait. And when you trace the streets back from the coast, the town itself feels alive, its neighborhoods shifting in tone with each passing block. Let's wander inward then toward Spooner Street, where the Griffin house rests in its familiar spot. In daylight, it's iconic. The yellow siding and green roof shining in the sun. At night, though, its charm transforms. The windows seem too square, the door too centered, and the shadows along the porch stretch too far into the street. Many who have studied Quahog's design, the way the show frames its buildings, notice that at night the streets feel wide but empty, as if the town itself expands into something unnervingly hollow. Imagine walking down Spooner Street alone, no laughter, no voices, no cars, just rows of houses with their cartoon-perfect geometry. Every home looks the same, but when the moonlight falls at just the right angle, it feels as though some houses lean closer, watching you pass. One porch light flickers, another window curtain shifts when no one's inside, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. Not Brian, not any named character, but a sound that vanishes as soon as you notice it. This feeling intensifies with Quahog's other landmarks. The drunken clam, so often filled with noise, is utterly still at closing time. Its sign creaks in the wind, the neon light dimming in a pulse that feels almost like breathing. The playground nearby, where local kids play in daytime cutaways, looks like a skeleton in the dark. Swings swaying, though no breeze moves. A merry-go-round turning just enough to make the sound of rust on metal pierce the silence. This is where the heart of Chapter 1 rests, in the idea that Quahog itself is not just a setting, but a presence, a character silently threading through the lives of the people who live there. It has its bright moments, its cartoon humor, its satirical edge, but beneath all of that lies a town with a pulse, a whisper, a history that never quite sleeps. What gives this chapter its haunted energy is the way familiarity turns uncanny. The viewer knows these houses, these streets, this bar, this playground. They've seen them 100 times in jokes and cutaways. Yet by leaning into the absence of life, into the strange silence of these locations, they transform into places where anything could be hiding. A curtain's twitch could be a joke in daylight, but at night it feels like a ghost. The Clam's neon sign is silly during happy hour, but in silence it's ominous. The playground is joyful with kids, but empty it becomes unsettling. By the end of this opening chapter, one thing becomes clear. Quahog is alive in more ways than one. Its streets breathe, its shoreline whispers, its landmarks wait in silence. And while the Griffin family continues their antics on the surface, there is something older, deeper, and darker humming beneath their hometown. That hum is what Chapter 2 will begin to unravel, the satire, the cynicism, and the voices that Brian himself so often channels, perhaps without ever realizing that Quahog had been speaking through him all along. Uneasy. If Quahog's haunted beginnings lay buried in its marshlands and drowned in its river, then its heart still pulsed with unease in the living spaces people built over it. The houses of Quahog, outwardly ordinary, carried their own strange stories, each one absorbing the memories of those who passed through. Spooner Street, now defined by laughter, quarrels, and cartoon absurdities, once bore the quiet sorrows of families that lived there long before the Griffins. Some of those families vanished in ways that left no closure. Children waking in the night to find their parents gone, neighbors hearing muffled screams carried through thin walls, a recurring pattern of unexplained disappearances. One house in particular, long demolished, was whispered about as the dwelling of the seventh window. Local lore claimed its seventh upstairs window never reflected the world outside. While all the other panes would catch the glow of the moon or the flicker of street lamps, this one remained dark, as though it faced something other than Quahog itself. Children dared each other to stand beneath it at midnight, swearing they saw faces staring down, not of the living residents, but of pale, grim figures unknown to them. When the house burned down one winter night, no explanation for the fire was ever found. The land was cleared, eventually repurposed, and now sits quietly with no sign of the terror it once hosted. But older residents still say that if you pass that patch of earth in the right hour, you'll feel colder there than anywhere else in town. Quahog's church, too, holds its shadows. St. Philip's has long been a site of weddings, baptisms, and solemn funerals, yet behind its stained glass lies an unsettling history. In its earliest days, it was erected as a place of refuge after storms ravaged the coast. Survivors often swore they saw figures following them into the sanctuary, drenched, shivering shapes who never spoke a word. When the lights were lit, no one was there, though puddles of water would appear in the aisles. Old records even note a priest who claimed the church bells rang by themselves in the dead of night, a tolling that signaled death would strike within the week. The bells were eventually repaired, the story dismissed as faulty mechanics, yet the legend of the death knell lingers, whispered quietly during wakes. Even Quahog schools have not been spared from stories. The old grammar school, closed decades ago, was remembered not for the lessons taught there, but for the strange way children reported seeing things in its hallways. Teachers often scolded students for daydreaming, when in truth the children were staring at figures only they could see. One account describes a boy who insisted there was another class behind the chalkboard, a group of children staring silently at him, their eyes darker than ink. After that, the boy never returned to school. Some say his family moved away suddenly, though no official records remain. The building itself has since been abandoned, its windows broken, its roof caving in, but those who trespass say they hear the faint scratching of chalk on boards in empty classrooms. What binds all these tales together is the persistence of memory in Quahog, a memory that refuses to let go. Every brick, every foundation, seems to absorb the anxieties, griefs, and tragedies of those who lived there. And these memories leak into the present in subtle ways, like ripples disturbing a calm surface. Sometimes in laughter that rings a little too sharply, sometimes in shadows that linger too long in the corner of an eye, sometimes in the quiet spaces between Quahog's jokes. And then there is the ocean, forever tied to Quahog's fate. The sea has always carried a double edge, a source of livelihood, and yet a hungry mouth. The coastline has witnessed more shipwrecks than any sailor cares to count. Entire vessels have gone missing within sight of shore, swallowed by sudden fogs. Families waiting at the docks claim to hear the faint cries of the lost, calling out from the mist. Voices carried but never delivered home. Local fishermen developed a superstition. Never answer when the sea calls your name. For those who do, it is said, will never step foot on land again. The legend of Captain Elias Harrow is perhaps the most retold. In the late 1800s, Harrow was a Quahog mariner, known for his daring voyages. He laughed at superstition, mocking the curse of the Black Pawtuxet River and the whispers of drowned souls. But on his final journey, he and his crew sailed into a storm that tore their vessel apart. When wreckage washed ashore days later, no bodies were found except for Harrow's hat, set upright in the sand as if placed there deliberately. For years afterward, townsfolk swore to see him wandering the coast in his sodden coat, staring at the horizon with hollow eyes. To this day, when fog rolls in heavy, some claim his figure appears briefly before dissolving back into the mist. Even in modern Quahog, where animated absurdities distract from darker truths, the ocean continues to claim lives. Reports of drownings are common enough, yet some cases carry details too strange to ignore. Lifeguards swear they've seen swimmers pulled under by unseen hands, only to resurface moments later with no one around them. Fishermen reel in nets, not with fish, but with fragments of old clothing, torn and waterlogged, belonging to no one they can identify. And always, always, the Black Pawtuxet whispers its secret song, a reminder that the land and the sea are bound by something older than the town itself. The Griffins, unknowingly, are merely the latest keepers of this haunted inheritance. Their chaos, their laughter, their arguments, all echo in a place steeped in unfinished stories. Theirs is the sitcom existence, yet beneath the punchlines lies a stage that has seen centuries of sorrow. When Stewie drifts to sleep, when Meg stares into her reflection, when Peter drunkenly stumbles home from the clam, each one treads lightly over ground layered with the footprints of the vanished. And perhaps that is the true unease of Quahog, that behind every joke, every bizarre escapade, every surreal adventure, lies the suggestion that none of it is built on stability. The houses stand, but the land beneath them shifts. The people laugh, but the silence afterward hums with memory. The streets bustle, but in the darkest hour when no one speaks, it feels as though the town itself is breathing. And in that breath lives every whisper, every drowned voice, every shadow pressed into Quahog's history, waiting, watching, and remembering. The old library air hung thick, the smell of dust and forgotten time clinging to the wooden beams overhead. As Brian and Stewie pressed deeper into the dim corridors, their footsteps echoed in a way that didn't quite match their movement, as though unseen steps were shadowing them. The shelves loomed like tall, silent guards, books stacked neatly yet carrying the weight of countless unspoken stories. Stewie brushed his tiny hand across one, sending up a cloud of dust that shimmered faintly in the muted light. He smirked, trying to keep his sharpness intact. But Brian could see a flicker of unease in his eyes. It was one thing to mock bedtime tales of haunted Quahog. It was another to stand in a place that felt like the very heart of them. The further they moved, the more oppressive the silence became. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of fabric when Brian shifted, felt amplified. Then a sudden draft stirred through the aisles, though no window or door appeared to be open. A single page fluttered out of a book and drifted down to the floor, landing right at Stewie's feet. He bent, snatched it up, and squinted at the faint ink. The words were strange, looping, almost ritualistic, as if written in a forgotten tongue. Brian leaned over, his brow furrowing. For the first time, his usual sarcastic quips failed him. Instead, he felt something stir, a cold weight pressing against his chest, whispering that perhaps these stories weren't so harmless after all. They continued on, clutching the paper as though it were some reluctant key, until the library seemed to shift around them. What had once been straight rows of shelves began to bend, forming subtle curves, a labyrinth that pulled them inward. "This isn't possible," Brian muttered, his voice low. "Libraries don't move." But Stewie, ever the daring adventurer, when it came to forbidden things, pressed forward. His tiny voice was steady, but his steps betrayed the nervous energy brimming beneath. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "we've stumbled into the version of Quahog no one's meant to see." The air grew colder. Their breath came out in faint puffs, ghostly wisps against the stale air. Somewhere ahead, a soft hum rose. Not quite music, not quite words, more like the echo of voices buried under centuries of silence. It was both alluring and unsettling, tugging them forward with invisible strings. And then at the end of a winding aisle, they saw it. A grand wooden door, far too elaborate for the modest old library. Its surface was carved with the strange markings, some of which matched the symbols on the paper Stewie clutched. The carving seemed to shift as the candlelight wavered, like living shadows caught in the wood. Neither of them spoke. Words would only diminish the gravity of what they had found. Brian finally swallowed hard and asked, "You sure you want to open it?" Stewie smirked, but his grip on the paper tightened. "Oh, Brian, don't be such a coward. The best stories are behind locked doors." With that, he pushed, and the heavy door creaked open, groaning as if it hadn't been moved in centuries. What lay beyond was not a simple reading room or archive, but a cavernous chamber, bathed in a dull, eerie glow. Massive tomes rested on pedestals, their pages open and glowing faintly with runes that seemed alive. The room was circular, and along the walls, portraits of Quahog's oldest residents stared down, their eyes following with unnerving precision. Some of the faces were familiar, ancestors of the Griffins, the Swansons, even the Pewterschmidts, though painted in an almost grotesque, shadowed style that warped their features into something uncanny. Stewie and Brian stepped inside cautiously. The door swung shut behind them, sealing with a hollow thud that made the chamber's glow flicker. Brian's tail bristled, and though he tried to maintain composure, his voice cracked slightly as he whispered, "This is way past bedtime stories. Stewie ignored him, eyes wide with fascination. He climbed onto a pedestal to examine one of the massive tomes, his tiny fingers tracing the lines of its glowing script. "This," he said in a hushed tone, "is Quahog's memory. Not the one we know, the one they buried." The humming grew louder. Now it had rhythm, almost like a chant pulsing from the very walls. Brian circled cautiously, his eyes catching on one particular portrait. A man who bore a striking resemblance to Peter Griffin, but thinner, sharper, dressed in old Puritan garb. His painted eyes seemed to shimmer faintly, like wet ink refusing to dry. Brian stepped closer, his throat dry, and muttered, "Peter's ancestor?" The painted figure blinked. Just once, slow and deliberate. Brian stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. Stewie whirled around, his face pale despite his bravado. "Did you see that too?" he asked quickly. Brian nodded mutely, every ounce of cynicism stripped away by the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. Before they could move, the chamber shifted. The portraits along the walls seemed to lean inward, their faces warping, mouths opening in silent screams. The tomes on the pedestals flipped their own pages violently, words spilling into the air like smoke, coiling around Brian and Stewie. The chanting grew louder, as though 100 voices were crying out from the walls themselves. Stewie clutched Brian's leg instinctively, the paper in his hand glowing faintly in response. The symbols on it pulsed, matching the rhythm of the chant. "Brian!" Stewie shouted above the rising cacophony. "This isn't just a story. We're inside it." The chamber trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the portrait's eyes burned faintly red, locked on the intruders who had dared to trespass. Brian grabbed Stewie and pulled him close, his voice firm despite the terror in his eyes. "We need to get out of here. Now!" They ran toward the door, the chamber's glow surging as though to stop them, shadows stretching across the floor to trip their steps. Just as the door loomed within reach, a voice thundered through the chamber, not loud in the ordinary sense, but echoing directly in their heads. "The stories you seek cannot be stolen. They come with a price." The door creaked open just enough for Brian to shove Stewie through, then he leapt after him, the weight of unseen hands clawing at his tail as he scrambled out. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, leaving them sprawled in the dust of the library's aisle. For a long moment, neither spoke. They lay there, panting, trembling, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Finally, Stewie broke the silence, his voice small but steady. "Brian, we just found Quahog's curse." Brian, shaken but oddly resolute, slowly pushed himself up. His sarcasm had vanished. There was no witty quip to ease the tension. Instead, he looked at the crumpled page in Stewie's tiny hand, still glowing faintly. "And I think," he said, his voice low, "it just found us." The night air in Quahog is never still for long. It's a town that feels like it remembers too much, as though each gust of wind carries the weight of a secret once whispered, or a laugh that ended too abruptly. After lingering by the abandoned asylum and the ghostly playground, we find ourselves being led deeper into the heart of Quahog, to places less obvious yet equally unsettling. The streets, the corners, the houses that line them, they all appear ordinary at a glance, but behind the curtains and beneath the foundations, stories fester and wait to be noticed. Take Spooner Street itself. For most viewers, it's nothing more than the cheerful little road where the Griffins live. The houses stand in their neat row, pastel-painted and filled with laughter, arguments, and the usual suburban antics. But late at night, when the television glow dims and the voices quiet, something different emerges. The neighborhood feels hollow, as if the buildings are shells of themselves. Windows stare outward like empty eyes. Sometimes there are reports of neighbors hearing footsteps on the road when no one is there. Not the crisp, lively steps of someone out for a stroll, but heavy, dragging ones, as though someone is being pulled along. Some say it's the lingering echo of characters who never quite belonged in Quahog, forgotten side figures who appeared briefly and vanished without explanation. Their stories unresolved, their presence incomplete, and so their steps wander still. Even the Griffin household isn't spared from this lingering atmosphere. On quiet nights, when Lois tucks the children into bed and Peter drifts off in his usual bumbling snore, there are moments when the house seems too still. A silence descends that feels heavier than rest. The creak of the staircase lingers even when no one is walking. The pipes groan like sighs. The attic, seldom seen or explored, holds boxes of old memories. Broken toys, yellowed photographs, discarded items from seasons past. But among those forgotten belongings, there are whispers of things that never belonged to the Griffins at all. Strange notes, scribbled in a language no one can quite place. Old clothes that don't match the size of anyone in the family. A child's drawing of a figure that doesn't resemble Stewie, Chris, or Meg, but instead shows a faceless outline with long arms reaching across the page. Moving beyond Spooner Street, Quahog hides other corners soaked in shadows. There's an alley near the Clam, one most patrons never pass through. On the surface, it's nothing more than a narrow path lined with dumpsters and flickering lamps. But those who've dared walk it after dark often report a strange sensation, the sound of laughter following them, echoing off the brick walls. Not the hearty, drunken laughter you'd expect near a bar, but laughter that is too high-pitched, too thin, and slightly distorted, as if it comes from a broken record. They say if you turn around, the alley will appear empty. But the laughter continues, circling you until you leave. No one knows who or what lingers there, but locals whisper that it might be tied to the town's obsession with humor itself. After all, Family Guy thrives on jokes, cutaways, and laughter. But perhaps somewhere in Quahog, the spirit of comedy itself has twisted into something less human. And then there's the elementary school, James Woods Regional High. During the day, it bustles with students and the occasional bizarre event. But at night, when the classroom's empty and the halls fall silent, the building takes on an eerie personality of its own. Teachers have spoken of staying late to grade papers, only to hear desks scraping across the floors in empty rooms. The sound of pencils tapping on chalkboards when no one's inside. Some even claim to have heard the faint echo of children laughing, only for it to cut off suddenly, replaced by silence so deep it feels suffocating. The school itself seems almost aware of its role as a backdrop to countless odd stories and forgotten students. In the stillness, it feels like the walls are trying to remember every name, every face, every laugh that has passed through, and in doing so, it repeats them back in strange, fragmented ways. One of the most unsettling tales tied to the school concerns its gymnasium. The basketball court is said to be haunted by the echo of a game that never ends. Late at night, the squeak of sneakers and the bounce of a ball can be heard faintly, as though an invisible team is still playing under the harsh glow of ghostly lights. Security guards swear they've seen shadows darting across the floor when no one is there. And if you stay long enough, some claim you can hear a voice whispering from the rafters, a low chant of encouragement. It sounds almost desperate, as though urging someone to win a game long since lost. All of these whispers, all of these half-seen figures and sounds, paint Quahog as a town that never sleeps in the way it should. The show may present it as quirky, colorful, and alive with absurdity, but beneath the surface it carries a haunted quality. Each corner, each building, each street, seems to hold on to fragments of moments, as if the town itself refuses to let go of its past. It clings to memories, both joyful and sorrowful, refusing to let them fade into nothingness. That refusal makes Quahog more than just a cartoon town. It makes it feel like a place caught between worlds, a stage where every joke and every sorrow leaves an imprint that echoes long after the scene ends. As we linger on these thoughts, the picture of Quahog begins to sharpen. It isn't simply haunted by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by the weight of its own history. The abandoned asylum, the empty playground, the restless streets of Spooner Street, the school's whispering halls. All of these spaces contribute to a tapestry of unease. And as the night deepens, we're drawn further into that tapestry, compelled to see not only the shadows of the town, but the ways in which its very fabric is stitched together by them. In this haunted vision of Quahog, the question becomes, is it the people who haunt the town, or is it the town that haunts its people? It's strange to think that the echoes beneath Quahog, the hollow whispers that drift through its oldest buildings, could have a voice of their own. And yet, as the town's foundations groan with age, as if tired from carrying centuries of memory, the past continues to seep upward. What we explored before were shadows, subtle hauntings that danced around Quahog's surface, hints of forgotten tragedies. But now we must lean in closer, peeling back the curtain to discover the voices themselves, the satire, the commentary, and the very essence of the spirits that linger in the bones of the town. Because if Quahog's bricks and beams could talk, they wouldn't just tell stories of loss. They would mock, laugh, and sneer at the absurdity of the living. Quahog has never been just a backdrop. It's a stage where every misstep of humanity is put on display. And in this haunted narrative, those ghosts are not quiet wraiths or faceless apparitions. They're cynics, much like Brian Griffin himself. Imagine for a moment a spectral crowd gathering along Spooner Street, unseen to most. They sit on invisible benches, murmuring like critics in an old theater, watching the living stumble through their hypocrisies. They smirk when politicians visit. They roll their ghostly eyes at greedy business owners, and they chuckle darkly at families pretending to be perfect. Quahog is a haunted town, yes, but it is haunted not only by tragedy, it is haunted by satire. And in this strange duality, Brian's voice has always served as a vessel. He has been Quahog's commentator, a dog who speaks with the cadence of a professor, yet drinks with the hunger of a common man. But what if that voice was not entirely his own? What if the weight of the town's ghosts, its cynics, its intellectuals, its broken dreamers, lingered inside him like a possession? There's a quiet terror in that thought that Brian's quips and lectures might not come solely from his own mind, but from a long-forgotten echo. His observations, his criticisms of politics and culture, could almost be seen as a continuation of voices that once lived in Quahog and refused to die. Step into the dimly lit corners of the drunken clam, and you can almost feel them. The regulars think they're alone, that the dim hum of the television or the clinking of glasses drowns out silence. But if you listen carefully, listen past the chatter, past the sound of Peter laughing too loudly, you might hear faint whispers riding along the walls, old voices sneering at the living. Maybe it's the spirit of a long-dead journalist who wrote for Quahog's forgotten papers, mocking how easily truth is drowned by gossip. Maybe it's the shade of a disillusioned philosopher who once lectured in some small Rhode Island hall, laughing bitterly at how his words now echo only in empty rooms. These voices weave themselves into Brian's character, and in this haunted story they do not disappear. They only sharpen the edge of his cynicism. But here lies the contradiction, one so chilling it almost feels alive. The ghosts that fuel satire also feed off Brian's insecurities. Each time he preaches intellect, each time he declares himself morally above the chaos of Quahog, the unseen audience of specters applauds, not with admiration, but with ridicule. To them, he is both vessel and victim. They watch him pontificate and then stumble into arrogance, falling prey to the very flaws he condemns in others. It is a cruel irony, one that the town itself seems to take delight in. The cynic haunted by his own hypocrisy. Picture this. A fog rolling across Spooner Street, thick and unnatural, swallowing the familiar pastel houses in a veil of gray. In that fog, shadows move, figures of the past, too hazy to fully identify. They linger just outside Brian's home, pressing against the walls like eager listeners at a lecture. Inside, Brian sips from his glass of scotch, pen in hand, ready to scrawl another critique of society. But with each sip, with each word, the shadows grow closer, feeding off his need to feel superior. He thinks he speaks alone, but the air is crowded. The satire does not come only from his mind. It is coaxed, shaped, and sharpened by the ghosts, who thrive on Quahog's contradictions. This is where the horror becomes intimate. It is not the jump scare kind of horror, not the sudden shock of a figure in the mirror. It's the kind that creeps under your skin, the realization that the very thoughts you believe to be yours may not belong to you. For Brian, the line between his own cynicism and the haunting echoes of Quahog's past becomes blurred. Was that cutting remark about politicians his own idea, or did it come from the restless shade of some long-dead senator who never got his chance to expose corruption? Was that mocking laugh his, or the echo of a ghostly audience that never stopped jeering? And in these contradictions, Brian unravels. He becomes both prophet and parody, voice of reason and laughingstock. The town around him seems to enjoy the spectacle, as though Quahog itself were an ancient theater feeding on human flaws. Each misstep is another scene, another act in a play directed not by man, but by the restless dead. The citizens go about their lives unaware, but for those who dare to look closely, like Brian, the curtain never truly falls. The cynicism deepens when you consider the personal cost. Brian might believe he is speaking truth to power, lifting the veil from society's hypocrisy. But what if that is exactly what the ghosts want him to do? What if, in feeding his intellect and sharpening his tongue, they are draining him? Each failed romance, each moment of arrogance, each stumble into indulgence. These are not coincidences. They are orchestrations, nudges from the invisible critics that haunt him. Brian becomes their instrument, a satirical mouthpiece doomed to fail in his personal life so that his voice remains sharp in public. And that is the chilling revelation. Satire is not his salvation, it is his curse. As the years rolled on and Quahog transformed from a scattered settlement into a bustling coastal town, the shadows never left. They lingered in the corners of every streetlight, stretched across the cobbled pathways, and drifted with the salty air that carried the whispers of the ocean. Locals began to notice something peculiar. No matter how much the town grew, there were always places where the air felt heavy, where footsteps seemed to echo longer than they should, and where the night never seemed to fully lift. It wasn't just imagination. It was as if the soil itself remembered. The church bells tolled each morning, but in the distance, faint sounds were heard, tones that didn't belong to any clock tower or human hand. Low chimes resonated in the stillness before dawn, faint but persistent. vibrating like a reminder that the town's foundation was never entirely stable. Residents dismissed it at first, attributing the strange music to the winds that passed through the harbor, but those who listened carefully noticed a rhythm, almost deliberate, as if something deep below the cobblestones was trying to speak. Among the earliest records kept by town scribes was a collection of testimonies describing what they called the Gray Walkers. These weren't full apparitions, but fleeting shapes seen in the misty fields at dusk. They walked slowly, their forms elongated, features blurred, always moving toward the center of town before fading into nothingness. Farmers who passed by at night would remove their hats and look away, whispering a prayer under their breath, because staring too long seemed to invite the shadows closer. By the time morning came, the ground where the figures were spotted often appeared disturbed, as though freshly walked upon, though no footprints could be found. The Griffin household itself would later be built not far from these grounds, long after the sightings had been documented and then largely forgotten. But the land remembers. Every brick and beam carries with it the weight of history, and though generations pass, certain echoes never fade. The town carried its ghostly inheritance quietly, a secret that lived just beneath the laughter of taverns and the bustle of marketplaces. It was in those subtle silences, when the town seemed too quiet, that one could almost hear the pulse of what lay beneath. As Quahog expanded, new families arrived, bringing their hopes and their livelihoods. Ships docked at the harbor more frequently, trade blossomed, and the air of prosperity seemed to mask the unease. But prosperity, like any flame, cast sharper shadows. With growth came the need for burial grounds, and with burial grounds came questions. The soil, already unsettled by what the earliest settlers had hidden away, seemed reluctant to hold the bodies of the dead. Graves sank unevenly. Headstones leaned within weeks, and sometimes, most disturbingly, the earth would reject what it had been given. Coffins would rise during heavy rains, washed to the surface as though the ground itself refused to keep them. This created a quiet panic, one never officially documented but shared in hushed voices at gathering. Families began holding the dead longer than tradition dictated, hesitant to bury them in a place that didn't seem willing to let go. Some turned to the ocean, consigning their loved ones to the waves, believing that water might cradle them more peacefully than earth ever could. But even those burials carried risk, for fishermen began reporting strange catches, nets that tangled on unseen objects, and on rare occasions, fragments of wood or cloth returned to the shore that looked eerily familiar. As the centuries passed, folklore became the town's hidden language. Parents would tell their children never to wander too far from the lantern-lit roads at night. Lovers strolling by the water's edge spoke of hearing faint footsteps behind them, though no one followed. And every family, no matter how modern or rational, held a story of their own, a moment when the ordinary world of Quahog cracked and the ghost of its beginnings slipped through. It is here in these early tales that we begin to see the formation of Quahog's dual nature. The cheerful, satirical town known to viewers, and the spectral undercurrent that never quite loosens its grip. What makes the lore unique is not just the presence of apparitions, but the way they coexist with the living, woven silently into the fabric of daily life. No great calamity announces them. No grand revelation explains them. They are simply there, patient and persistent, shaping the lives of those who dare to notice. The taverns, for instance, became places not just for ale and laughter, but for vigilance. Sailors reported voices calling their names from the dark corners, voices too soft to belong to any patron, A sudden chill would drift through the room, extinguishing candles for a brief, unsettling second. Patrons would clear their throats, lift their mugs, and pretend not to notice, but the silence always carried weight after such moments. The shadows seemed to feed on acknowledgement, so silence was the town's defense. To speak of what you saw was to give it strength. Even the architecture of Quahog reflects this history. Narrow alleys twist unpredictably, leading to places that locals avoid. Windows were designed smaller in older homes, shutters always kept close at night, and cellars were built deep with doors reinforced in ways that seem excessive for a simple coastal settlement. These were not just practical choices. They were measures taken against something. Something people feared but could not name. And yet, as much as the town struggled to keep these stories buried, they carried on like smoke seeping through cracks. By the 1800s, Quahog was already being whispered about in nearby towns as a place where the dead walked lightly. Travelers told stories of unnerving encounters, a carriage driver who saw a pale hand resting on his shoulder, though no one sat behind him, a merchant who heard children laughing in the empty square at midnight, or a guest at an inn who woke to find muddy footprints circling his bed. None of these accounts made their way into official records, but they lived on in folklore, handed down with a seriousness that hinted at truth. And what of the families who had lived there since the first foundation stones were set? Their silence was the most telling of all. The oldest families never denied the stories, but they never confirmed them either. They would simply nod, a quiet acknowledgement that some things need no validation. In their silence lay an unspoken pact. The town belonged to both the living and the dead, and neither could claim it fully. It is in this shared history, this uneasy balance, that the Griffin household eventually became part of the lore. But before their arrival, Quahog itself was already alive with spirits, the ground already saturated with memory, the laughter, satire, and absurdity that would one day define the show sit atop centuries of unease, like a carnival built over a burial ground. And perhaps that is exactly what gives the town its peculiar charm, that tension between comedy and dread, between the brightness of its jokes and the shadows lurking beneath its foundation. The silence of Quahog seemed heavier that night, as though the entire town was holding its breath beneath the glow of street lamps that hummed with an electric pulse. The legends we began to unravel, the whispers of restless spirits, forgotten tunnels, and houses that seemed to breathe in their own eerie rhythm, were only the surface of something deeper. That sense of unease lingers not only in the air, but in the stories that the townsfolk themselves are almost too afraid to tell. These tales rarely make it past the dinner table or the local bar chatter, and yet, when pieced together, they begin to form a picture, a tapestry woven of sorrow, superstition, and unanswered questions that echo through the history of Quahog. One of the most haunting patterns across these accounts is the strange link between the land itself and the people who live on it. Families report recurring dreams of the same faceless figure, standing on the outskirts of their property, watching silently. The figure never enters, never speaks, and yet the dreams return again and again, generation after generation, as though tied not to the individuals but to the soil beneath their feet. Imagine the unease of waking up night after night, drenched in sweat, recalling the same set of hollow eyes staring back at you from the edge of your own backyard. And when these families compare notes, they find details too similar to dismiss as coincidence. The stance of the figure, the angle of the head, even the dim flicker of lantern light behind it. Such imagery begins to raise questions. Is this entity a trick of the mind, some subconscious projection of shared fear, or is it truly tied to something that Quahog's earth refuses to bury? We know that much of the town was built over land once occupied by early settlements and, more grimly, sites that saw their share of violence and loss. If echoes of trauma truly remain in the earth, then perhaps Quahog itself is not just haunted by memory, but cursed with a kind of spiritual repetition, replaying sorrow like a broken record. And when Brian, the ever-cynical observer of life, leans his perspective over these tales, his skepticism gives way to fascination. For Brian, legends like this straddle a line between metaphor and truth. He wants to see them as symbols of collective guilt or cultural shadow, yet even he cannot dismiss the strange consistency. Stewie, with his natural curiosity and flair for darkness, treats such accounts like puzzles, as though every dream and whispered story is a clue to a greater hidden architecture. Together, their contrasting views invite us deeper, not to mock these accounts, but to dwell in them, to feel their weight, as if we were the ones hearing footsteps in an empty hallway or catching shadows at the edge of a lamplight. As these stories circulate, a theme emerges: silence in places that should be alive with sound. A farmhouse where the crickets stop chirping the moment the porch light goes out. A small street near the heart of Quahog where dogs refuse to bark after midnight, their bodies rigid, eyes fixated on some invisible threat. Even within the Griffin household, subtle phenomena appear: a clock that stops ticking for no reason, a window that creaks open though it was firmly latched, faint whispers carried through the air vents that vanish when investigated. None of these moments are dramatic enough to make the news, but they compound in the mind, leaving behind a residue of unease that grows more powerful the more it is ignored. There's something especially chilling about silence when it arrives unnaturally. Nature has its own hum, its rhythm, and when that rhythm is broken, it often signals danger. In Quahog, silence itself has become a warning. Locals will tell you, if you press them enough, that when you feel that sudden stillness, when the very air seems to stop, it's not emptiness you're feeling, it's presence. And the presence is waiting for you to notice it. But why do these moments persist? Why Quahog? Some suggest that the town sits on ley lines, those mysterious alignments of energy that mystics and occultists have long claimed amplify supernatural forces. Others point toward the darker chapters of Quahog's founding: disputes between settlers, violent clashes, and the quiet burials of the nameless dead who never made it into official records. Suggestion is unsettling: that beneath Quahog's suburban calm lies a restless graveyard of memory, and the spirits are not so much haunting as they are demanding recognition. Brian, caught in his role as commentator of human folly, cannot ignore how these ghostly stories often mirror the living struggles of the town. Hypocrisy, unresolved guilt, and forgotten pain, these too are hauntings, not of the paranormal, but of the emotional and psychological sort. Yet even as he makes this observation, he feels the nagging discomfort of being watched in his own home at night, the sound of paws on the floorboards when he himself is the only one awake. Cynicism fades quickly when shadows align too neatly with the whispered lore. Stewie, ever the scientist and dreamer of dominion, begins to hypothesize. If the fabric of Quahog is indeed woven with unresolved echoes, then perhaps there is a system to it. A network of haunted nodes connected through streets, alleys, and forgotten basements. His imagination paints the town as a living organism, pulsing with ghostly energy. A place where every brick, every tree, and every room is part of a greater map of sorrow. And while this could be dismissed as a child's overactive fantasy, The weight of the town's stories makes it harder to laugh away. There is one particularly unnerving tale that locals whisper when they dare. The story of the house with no address. It's said to appear on different streets, sometimes for a single night, sometimes for a week, and then vanish without a trace. Residents swear they've walked past it, a pale gray building with a front porch light flickering, though when they return the next day, the house is gone. Maps, property records, and even photographs refuse to confirm its existence, yet too many have seen it to deny. And when asked what they felt while looking at it, they always use the same words: dread, recognition, and the overwhelming urge to never step inside. It is these kinds of stories that give Quahog its haunted pulse. Tales so uncanny they defy the ordinary rules of memory and testimony. When a skeptic like Brian wrestles with them, he begins to realize that Quahog itself may not be a town haunted by ghosts, but a ghost disguised as a town. A place that wears its suburban face by day, but by night, becomes something far older, more sentient, and far more terrifying than anyone has dared to admit. And so the cycle continues. People live their lives. Laughter echoes through living rooms, bars fill with chatter, and yet underneath it all lies the whisper, the flicker, the silence that arrives without warning. This is Quahog's truest voice, the voice that cannot be silenced by denial because it does not depend on belief to exist. The whispers that Brian had caught in the silence of that back alley were not isolated. They were part of a larger tapestry, threads pulling him deeper into a web of connections between Quahog's architecture, its forgotten citizens, and its uncanny silences. For Brian, whose natural skepticism often shielded him from irrational fear, the moments following that encounter were different. He couldn't shake the way the air had changed, how it felt weighted, as though carrying centuries of unspoken truths. It was no longer just curiosity. It was dread intermingled with fascination, the kind of feeling that made one lean forward even when every instinct said to run. When Brian returned home that night, he didn't speak of it. Stewie, sharp as ever, noticed the way his canine companion lingered by the window longer than usual, ears twitching, eyes scanning. "Expecting visitors, are we?" Stewie had asked in his typical smug drawl, but Brian had simply muttered, "Something's off." That phrase became his refrain in the following days, and though Stewie initially teased him, even the child genius began to notice subtle anomalies. There were nights when the Griffin home itself seemed to creak differently, floorboards groaning in rhythm rather than randomness, doors rattling when no draft passed through. The most haunting shift came from the neighborhood. Quahog was a town defined by noise, Peter's obnoxious laughter, Cleveland's warm chuckles, Quagmire's sleazy punchlines, but now, in those late hours past midnight, silence stretched unnaturally. It wasn't the restful quiet of sleep. It was suppression, as though every sound was being swallowed before it could escape. Both Brian and Stewie began waking at the same times each night, drawn not by dreams, but by an eerie synchronicity they couldn't explain. The town itself seemed to be calling them, testing how much they could notice before turning away. One evening, Brian found himself drawn back to that alley, unable to resist the lure of unfinished questions. Stewie, ever eager for adventure, demanded to come along. Together they retraced steps beneath a cloudy sky that muffled the moonlight. When they arrived, the alley looked ordinary: trash cans, brick walls, the faint stench of damp cardboard. But something in its geometry was wrong. Stewie was the first to comment, squinting at the walls. "Do you see that? The bricks don't line up. It's as though this wall was patched together from different decades." Brian stepped closer, paw tracing along the uneven mortar, and with a gentle push, a section of the wall seemed to breathe inward. Not crumble, not shift, breathe. They both froze, silence pressing on their ears. Then, almost as if acknowledging their presence, the wall released a faint sigh, a gust of air carrying with it the smell of mildew, chalk, and something older, like burnt wood. Stewie, half amused, half unnerved, whispered, "Congratulations, Brian. You've discovered Quahog's first haunted lung." But Brian wasn't laughing. He stared into the cracks, swearing he could hear faint chanting, layered voices overlapping like a distorted choir. The sound wasn't loud, it was subtle, designed to unnerve rather than overwhelm. From that night on, their perception of Quahog shifted. The town wasn't merely haunted in the way horror movies painted suburbia with cheap scares. No, this was subtler, more invasive. It was as though the town itself was alive, hiding scars in plain sight, waiting for anyone curious or foolish enough to peel back its surface. Buildings seemed slightly tilted when viewed from a corner. Shadows clung to places they shouldn't, and most disturbingly, they started noticing familiar faces in strange places. Mrs. Wilson, a kindly old woman who had been dead for years, was spotted by Brian standing in the frozen food aisle of the stop shop, her form flickering between present and absent, as if the store lights couldn't fully register her. Peter mentioned offhandedly seeing Old Man Jenkins mowing his lawn again, completely forgetting the man had died 2 winters ago. The town was recycling its people, weaving fragments of memory into flesh and bone, placing them back into routines as though nothing had changed. Stewie, fascinated by the logic of it, began sketching maps. He charted locations where anomalies appeared, connecting them like constellations. To his horror, a pattern emerged, an overlapping spiral with the Griffin house at its center. "You realize what this means, don't you?" Stewie muttered, showing Brian the diagrams. "We're not just bystanders. Whatever is happening here, our family sits right in the middle of it. We're the eye of the storm." Brian, skeptical but shaken, tried to brush it off, yet the more he thought, the more it gnawed at him. The Griffins were always at the heart of Quahog's chaos, sometimes comically, other times tragically. Could it be more than narrative convenience? Could the family itself be tethered to the town's spectral heart, unwillingly serving as anchors for something much older, much darker? The idea haunted him, especially as his nightly walks grew stranger. On one occasion, he found paw prints in the mud that mirrored his own stride, identical in size and spacing, following him step for step. But when he turned, nothing was there. Another time, he swore he heard Lois humming in the kitchen late at night, only to find her asleep in bed. The tune, faint and haunting, continued even as he stood in the empty kitchen, the refrigerator light flickering like a dying candle. The unease grew thicker. The town seemed to be testing them, playing with their perception, warping reality just enough to cause doubt, but never enough to offer proof. To anyone else, Quahog was the same dysfunctional, cartoonish place it had always been. But to Brian and Stewie, layers were being peeled back, revealing a skeletal framework of whispers, shadows, and memories that refused to stay buried. And the spiral kept tightening. Stewie's research indicated the spiral of anomalies was contracting, circling inward night after night. "It's coming for us," Stewie muttered one evening, staring at his childlike sketches with a seriousness that chilled Brian. "Whatever this is, it isn't spreading outward. It's collapsing inward. By the time the spiral reaches its core, it will all converge on us, on this house." Brian wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but then came the night when every clock in the Griffin home froze at 3:17 a.m., not stopped, frozen. The hands were physically immovable, even when Peter clumsily tried to force them forward. Electronics glitched, lights dimmed, and outside the town fell into an unnatural hush. In that silence, Brian and Stewie both heard it again, that low, overlapping chant, echoing from nowhere and everywhere, carrying the weight of Quahog's forgotten dead. Stewie, pale but determined, looked at Brian with a rare sincerity. This isn't just Quahog. This is us. We're part of it. And if we don't uncover why, the spiral won't stop. It'll consume us. Brian didn't respond. For the first time, the cynic in him faltered, and he realized the truth. Quahog wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And now it was breathing down their necks. It was strange how the shadows of Quahog seemed to shift depending on who was walking through them. For the ordinary passerby, a streetlight flickering might have meant nothing more than faulty wiring. But for Brian, and for those who had been paying attention to the growing strangeness, every sputter of dim light felt like the town was blinking, hiding something, and then revealing it again. The cynicism that Brian wore so casually as armor had now begun to falter, not because he stopped being a critic of the world, but because the world itself was starting to reveal flaws that even his sharp words couldn't fully contain. He could sense that the town itself was participating in some kind of performance, one whose script stretched beyond human knowledge, and yet every family in Quahog was an unwilling actor. The strange thing was that whenever Brian tried to articulate this suspicion, he would catch himself speaking in fragments. His words would dissolve like smoke. He might begin with something coherent. Doesn't it seem like the town is, I don't know, rehearsing? But then the thread would fray. His own cynicism, once a weapon against others, now turned inward, whispering, "You're losing it. You're just a dog who thinks too much. Nobody else notices because there's nothing to notice." But that explanation no longer satisfied him, because the evidence was building. Conversations repeated themselves. Neighbors made the same gestures, with the same inflection, as if caught in a loop. And at night, under the pale glow of the moon, whole streets would fall silent at the exact same minute, as though the town itself were holding its breath. It was during one of those silent nights that Brian found himself near the Quahog Public Library, normally a place of comfort filled with the faint musk of old books and the quiet hum of overhead lights. The building now seemed like a monument to something much older. He pushed the door open, and the sound of the hinges echoed unnaturally loud. The interior was deserted, but the bookshelves were different. Instead of their usual neat arrangement, some of them had been dragged to form a spiral pattern in the center of the main hall. The spines of the books themselves looked scorched, as if touched by flame, though no fire alarm had been triggered and no smoke lingered. At the center of the spiral lay a single open book, blank pages fluttering as though stirred by an invisible wind. Brian stepped closer, his paws tapping against the wooden floor, and as he approached, the fluttering stopped. The book's pages went still, revealing only one phrase scrawled in uneven ink. "The cynic speaks for the dead." His breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scoff, to laugh it off as some college kid's prank, but the air was too heavy, too deliberate. He closed the book quickly, but when he glanced at the shelves again, they were back in place, perfectly aligned as if they'd never been moved. Only the open book in his paws betrayed that anything had been different. That night, when he returned home, Stewie was waiting for him in the living room. The toddler sat cross-legged on the carpet, his expression unusually calm. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Brian hesitated, then nodded. He didn't need to ask what it was. Stewie continued, Quahog is trying to tell us something. Or maybe warn us. The satire, the nonsense, the contradictions, they're not random. They're symptoms. Brian sank onto the couch, his tail twitching. Symptoms of what? He asked. Though part of him wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Stewie tilted his head, eyes narrowing. A curse, or a story so old it's become part of the town's bones. And we're living in its newest draft. The thought chilled Brian more than he cared to admit. A curse woven into the foundation of Quahog itself, one that used humor, cynicism, and satire not as entertainment but as camouflage. It explained why the town felt like it was rehearsing, why the jokes always came back around, why even tragedy was played for laughs. It wasn't just Family Guy's world bending reality for comedy. It was Quahog bending reality for survival, forcing its inhabitants to repeat scenes like actors bound to a haunted script. As days went by, Brian began noticing new details. The newscaster, Tom Tucker, for instance, had repeated the exact same phrase 2 nights in a row, down to the cadence. Good evening, Quahog, where nothing ever changes except when it does. The first time it sounded like satire. The second time it felt like ritual. Even Peter's ridiculous antics, which Brian had always dismissed as stupidity, now seemed calculated, like the behavior of a jester meant to keep an audience distracted, while something more sinister unfolded behind the curtain. But what disturbed Brian most were the places in Quahog that people avoided speaking about. The boarded-up house on the far edge of Spooner Street, for instance, where curtains fluttered even though no one lived there. Or the abandoned drive-in theater that still glowed faintly at midnight, projecting films onto a tattered screen even though the power had long been cut. Each of these places seemed to hum with a quiet energy as though they were nodes in a network of forgotten truths, points where the town's haunted narrative leaked into view. Stewie began cataloging these locations, marking them on a crude map with red ink. It's not random, he muttered one evening, as he spread the map across his bedroom floor. These sites form a pattern, one that centers right beneath Spooner Street. He tapped the center with his small finger. Our home. Brian felt his stomach turn. The idea that their own house was the epicenter of Quahog's haunting lore was unsettling, though in some ways it explained the constant absurdity of their lives. Every disaster, every bizarre encounter, every surreal twist of fate seemed to radiate outward from the Griffin household. They weren't just a family living in Quahog. They were the anchors keeping the curse alive. As Stewie theorized aloud, Brian caught himself staring at the boy with a strange mix of fear and admiration. Stewie's cynicism mirrored his own, but while Brian wielded it as a defense, Stewie used it as a scalpel, cutting through layers of reality to expose what lay beneath. Together, they formed a strange partnership. The disillusioned dog and the precocious child, both standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. The more they pieced together, the more Brian began to feel the weight of that phrase he'd read in the library. The cynic speaks for the dead. Perhaps his role as Quahog's sarcastic commentator was not just personality, but destiny. Maybe his cynicism wasn't just a shield, but a channel, a way for the town's buried voices to find expression. If that was true, then his words were not his own. They were echoes, and if they were echoes, then who was listening? One night, after another long evening of whispered theories, Brian stepped outside for air. The streets were empty, the air thick with fog. He could barely see the street lamps through the haze, and then he heard it faint but unmistakable, the sound of laughter. Not the hearty, drunken laughter of Quahog's bars, nor the canned laughter of a sitcom. This was something deeper, more resonant. and it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It echoed off the houses, the pavement, the very air. He froze, every hair on his body standing on end. The laughter faded, but its imprint lingered, like a phantom hand pressing against his chest. When he returned inside, Stewie looked at him knowingly. "You heard it, didn't you?" Brian didn't reply, but he didn't need to. The haunted satire of Quahog was no longer a theory. It was alive, breathing, and speaking through them. And as they sat together in the dimly lit living room, the flicker of the television casting eerie shadows across the walls, both of them realized that this was only the beginning. Quahog's truths were waiting, buried in its laughter, hidden in its contradictions. And the deeper they dug, the closer they would come to uncovering what the town had been hiding all along, secrets that might not want to be uncovered. As Brian's commentary fades into silence, we begin to notice what rests beneath it. The longing that doesn't always reach his words, but hums beneath his voice like an unresolved note. For all the sharpness with which he observes the world, Brian is not a creature of detachment. He is, at his core, a being caught in the pull of relationships, always moving between the desire to belong and the ache of being perpetually out of place. In this softer, more shadowed light, his story no longer feels like satire, but something far more haunting. The tale of a heart that never fully finds what it seeks. The Griffin household has always been a backdrop for Brian's complicated web of affections. He is, in many ways, the quiet witness to human intimacy, forever just outside of it, forever observing what he cannot fully enter. His longing often takes the shape of romance, a pattern of love affairs that stretch across the series like scattered pieces of a broken mirror. From human women who find themselves drawn to his eloquence, to fleeting sparks of attraction that never last, Brian moves from one encounter to another as though he is trying to fill an emptiness that grows heavier with each attempt. There is a tragedy in this rhythm. Every time he draws close, he is reminded that something about him will not fit. He is a dog, charming, witty, cultured, but still a dog in a world where lines between pet and partner are never fully erased. This tension creates an air of inevitability around his romances. They are doomed before they begin, yet he still throws himself into them with a kind of desperate hope. Perhaps, just once, he believes, he will find someone who sees him not as a novelty, not as a curiosity, but as an equal, a companion in every sense of the word. One of Brian's earliest and most memorable entanglements is with Jillian, the kind-hearted but airheaded woman whose simplicity contrasts with his intellectual posturing. On the surface, she seems almost absurd as a partner for someone who prides himself on wit and sophistication. And yet Brian lingers in that relationship longer than many would expect. Why? Because, in Jillian's innocence, there is a comfort he rarely experiences. She doesn't demand that he prove himself. She doesn't press him to be sharper, deeper, or more brilliant. With her, he doesn't have to perform. For a time, that simplicity is enough. But as always, the restless part of him resurfaces, convincing him that he is meant for something more profound. And so he sabotages what little peace he had, walking away in search of something greater, though what that something might be is never clear. This pattern repeats itself throughout his life. Moments of connection followed by inevitable collapse. It is not just romance that eludes him, it is belonging itself. The irony is sharp. In his constant search for companionship, Brian is surrounded by people who, in their own way, love him deeply. The Griffins accept him not as a pet, but as a member of their family. And yet, even in that acceptance, he sometimes feels estranged. He is not quite a man, not quite a dog, not quite anything that fits easily into the categories the world provides. That in-betweenness becomes his most haunting feature, the shadow that follows him no matter how far he tries to run. This is most evident in his bond with humans. Brian has always seen himself as more than a pet, a sentiment he expresses in countless small ways. He drinks at the bar with Peter, debates politics at the dinner table, drives a car, dates women, and pursues literary aspirations. These are all markers of a human life, gestures that prove his difference from the dogs around him. But in these attempts at assimilation, he exposes his deepest wound. He is always trying to prove something, always fighting to be seen as worthy of standing alongside those he considers his peers. The tragedy is not that the Griffins fail to see him this way, they often do, but that Brian himself cannot fully believe it. At times, his role as more than a pet places him in the position of confidant, even caretaker. Lois turns to him when she needs a voice of reason. Meg seeks his occasional approval. Chris leans on him for advice, and Peter treats him as an equal drinking companion. In these roles, Brian achieves a kind of belonging, but it is conditional and fleeting. He is needed, yes, but never fully understood. The lines of family blur, and yet the one thing he craves, the absolute certainty of being someone's indispensable partner, remains out of reach. The ache grows louder in moments of solitude. Brian's loneliness is not the absence of people around him. He is rarely alone in that sense, but the absence of connection that feels whole and unshakable. His romances fall apart, his friendships shift with the winds of convenience, and his family, while loving, can never erase the fact that he is caught between worlds. It is in this loneliness that Brian's most haunting qualities emerge. The confident exterior, the wit, the cultured tastes, all of it masks the quiet truth that he is terrified of being left behind, of being forgotten, of existing forever as someone who almost belonged but never quite did. This is why his place in the Griffin family feels both secure and fragile at once. He knows they love him, but he also knows he is replaceable in ways he cannot admit. The family has endured with and without him. They have survived his departures, his deaths, even his replacements. This reality cuts deep, fueling his insecurities and leaving him with the gnawing question of whether he truly matters in the way he wants to. And yet, it is precisely this fragility that makes Brian such a human figure. His struggles echo the universal fear of being unseen, of giving love without ever receiving it in the same measure, of moving through life surrounded by people yet still feeling the cold shadow of loneliness pressing in. When we peel back the satirist and the cynic, the intellectual, what we are left with is not a caricature, but a hauntingly familiar figure. Someone desperate for love, terrified of irrelevance, and endlessly caught in the cycle of reaching out, only to find emptiness waiting on the other side. This ache carries forward like a quiet heartbeat into his companionship with Stewie, a relationship that will reveal sides of Brian we rarely see, sides raw, vulnerable, and unguarded. But before that bond unfolds, we must sit with Brian's solitude, his romances that dissolve into memory, and the way he stands at the threshold of family, always close but never fully inside. For it is here, in this haunting space between closeness and distance, that his story deepens and the true weight of his character begins to emerge. The more we follow the footsteps of these intertwined stories, the clearer it becomes that Family Guy has never been satisfied with playing things simply. Where most shows may have leaned on broad jokes or predictable family hijinks, This one often dances between extremes, moving from crude humor to sharp satire, from outrageous slapstick to moments that feel strangely heavy with meaning. And nowhere is this clearer than when we continue tracing how these absurd crossovers, strange parallels, and hidden reflections open to yet another layer of narrative, the place where parody shades into allegory and where each character becomes part of a haunting mirror of the others. When Stewie interacts with characters beyond his family, particularly during those experimental episodes, we begin to see the writers exploring themes of reflection and self-image. Think of how often he finds himself confronting versions of what he might become, or worse, versions of what he fears he might never be. These strange narrative encounters almost feel like ghostly warnings, little prophecies carried on the edges of episodes disguised as comedies. The humor masks it, but for an audience that looks closer, there's a shiver behind the laugh track. The child genius in the family home is constantly in dialogue with the shadows of what his future might hold. And it is this eerie dialogue that creates a uniquely unsettling undertone. Brian, too, exists in this uncanny territory, especially when he crosses over with Stewie. His sophistication, his lofty ideals, and his endless desire to matter seem noble at first glance, but the show often places him in surreal scenarios that strip away his illusions. Each failed book, each unfulfilled romance, each time his own voice echoes back at him in mockery. These moments play like specters clinging to his carefully curated self-image. Just as Stewie is haunted by who he might become, Brian is haunted by who he already is, by the fear that all his pretensions are transparent. This interplay between them is not just comedic banter. It is a gothic dance of identities unraveling in front of us. And then there is Peter, the unwitting centerpiece of so many of these stories. While his antics usually serve as chaotic comic relief when viewed through this darker, more allegorical lens, he begins to resemble something like the fool in a medieval morality play, bumbling, reckless, and destructive, but in a way that forces everyone else's deeper truths to come to the surface. Peter is both jester and destroyer, a kind of force of entropy that reveals what the others are clinging to. When he tears down the illusions around him, whether through sheer stupidity or unfiltered honesty, the others are forced to face their own ghosts. It's telling that so many of these storylines operate in cycles, like recurring hauntings. Brian fails again and again. Stewie schemes and collapses into vulnerability again and again. Lois wrestles with her own suppressed desires, and Meg suffers the endless cruelty of her family. The cycles themselves have a haunting quality, as though these characters are trapped in a looped narrative, doomed to repeat their mistakes with variations but no resolution. There's a strange comfort in it for the audience. We know what to expect. But at the same time, it carries a subtle dread. What if none of them ever escape? What if these characters are fated to circle these same patterns forever, like restless spirits in a house that refuses to let them go? That house, of course, is 31 Spooner Street itself. The Griffin home is drawn simply, lit brightly, often shown in the most ordinary ways. But in the quiet background of the lore, it becomes something more than a suburban set piece. It is a container of stories, a stage where each ghostly cycle repeats itself. From its walls, secrets echo. From its rooms, unspoken tensions linger. The home is at once shelter and prison, a domestic space and a haunted manor. The fact that so many episodes begin and end in its living room or kitchen gives it a feeling of inevitability, as though no matter where the characters travel in their absurd adventures, they will always return to the same uncanny ground zero. it is worth lingering here on the sense of inevitability. Family Guy's humor often comes from subverting expectations, but its structure often reinforces the opposite. The idea that no matter how wild things get, the characters are trapped in their roles, forever circling. This paradox, chaotic freedom on the surface, suffocating repetition underneath, creates the haunting undertone of the series. It is as though we are watching spirits trying to break free, only to snap back into their assigned places. The audience laughs at the surface jokes, but the deeper rhythm carries a weight that lingers after the laughter fades. If we think of Stewie as a restless ghost of potential futures, and Brian as the haunted echo of wasted presence, then Peter is the storm that stirs them, the chaotic wind that keeps their ghosts from settling. Lois, in her moments of yearning and rebellion, resembles the figure of a restless soul trying to remember a life she never got to fully live, while Meg's suffering becomes its own echo chamber of pain, the voice of someone who has been buried alive in mockery and invisibility. Each character carries a spectral trace, and when the show leans into parody and surreal storytelling, those traces light up like flickering candles in the dark. But beyond the characters themselves, there is the show's relationship with time. Family Guy often uses cutaway gags, surreal flashbacks, and absurd digressions, and these disruptions of linear time are part of its comedic style. Yet, when seen from another angle, they mimic the fractured nature of memory and haunting. The past intrudes on the present without warning. Random associations pull the characters out of their lives into strange other places, only to drop them back again. These temporal fractures create a dreamlike, sometimes nightmarish quality, where the audience is never sure what belongs to reality and what belongs to the imagination. The characters laugh it off, but underneath, there's the unsettling feeling of time looping, breaking, and refusing to progress. The clearest example of this can be found in episodes that end with nothing resolved. A dramatic event may unfold. Brian dies, Stewie travels in time, Peter discovers some absurd truth. But by the next episode, everything is back to normal, as though nothing ever happened. This reset function, necessary for the structure of an animated sitcom, has the eerie side effect of making the stories feel ghostly. Events pass through the characters like phantoms, leaving traces of memory but no lasting change. It is a cycle of haunting, where nothing ever truly dies and nothing ever truly sticks. And this is where the allegorical nature of the show becomes even more powerful. For while it is, on the surface, a comedy filled with parody and outrageous jokes, underneath it is a story about lives lived in fragments, about characters who exist in cycles of desire and disappointment, about a home that becomes less a setting and more a ghostly stage. The laughter makes it easy to forget, but once you've noticed the shadows, it becomes impossible to unsee them. This haunted quality of repetition and reset also deepens the connection between Family Guy and its audience. Viewers return week after week, year after year, to watch the same cycles play out. There's comfort in the familiarity, but also a strange reflection of our own lives. We laugh because their absurd cycles mirror our own, our routines, our mistakes, our endless repetitions. The haunted house of Spooner Street is not just theirs, it is ours too, a mirror held up to our own patterns, made digestible through satire. And so as we continue unfolding the darker textures of this series, it becomes clear that beneath the comedy lies a ghost story told in fragments, not a ghost story in the traditional sense of rattling chains and flickering lights, but one where the haunting comes from the characters themselves, from the inevitability of their cycles, from the echo of stories that never fully resolve. It is the kind of haunting that doesn't scream but whispers, one that settles into the edges of laughter and lingers there long after the episode ends. It is here, within the quiet rhythm of companionship, that Brian's story begins to twist into a deeper conflict. His life, though filled with moments of laughter and conversation, carries the invisible tension of identity. He is not just a pet, though the world often treats him as such. He is not fully human, though his thoughts, ambitions, and desires mirror those of the people he lives among. This strange liminal space becomes the backdrop for one of the most haunting aspects of Brian's existence, his constant negotiation of who he truly is. And it is in this blurred line between dog and man, family member and outsider, that his search for belonging takes root. The Griffin household is the clearest arena where the struggle is played out. To outsiders, Brian is the family dog, walking on 2 legs or 4, depending on the gag of the moment, but still the pet nonetheless. Yet inside those walls, he is invited to sit at the dinner table, to voice his opinions on politics, to drink and debate with Peter, and to serve as both confidant and critic for Lois. He exists in an elevated space where he is indispensable, and yet the very fact that he remains a dog undercuts that status at every turn. This paradox gnaws at him. While Stewie respects him as an intellectual equal, Peter sometimes reduces him to a punchline, and Quagmire outright despises him with biting cruelty. The tension never truly disappears, and Brian's quest for companionship is defined by this battle between dignity and dismissal. Brian often imagines himself beyond the role assigned him. There are episodes where his dreams of being a novelist, a playwright, or even a political voice reflect his hunger to transcend. But dreams, in his case, do not always materialize into victories. His manuscripts are rejected, his ideas mocked, and his sense of being more than a pet constantly chipped away by failure. It is not simply that the world fails to recognize his talent. It is that he too struggles with the discipline and confidence required to actualize it. In these failures, his isolation deepens. To be part of a family is to belong, but to belong while feeling misunderstood is a haunting solitude of its own. Stewie, once again, becomes a central figure in this narrative. Their bond is not just the humorous odd couple dynamic that entertains audiences, but a profound commentary on companionship itself. Both Stewie and Brian, in their own ways, are outsiders. Stewie, the hyper-intelligent baby with world domination schemes, and Brian, the intellectual dog forever wrestling with identity. Together, they recognize each other's longing for recognition. Their adventures, often laced with absurd comedy, carry beneath them a thread of desperate searching, 2 souls trying to prove they matter in a universe that dismisses them. It is in this unlikely friendship that Brian experiences one of the purest forms of companionship, unburdened by pretense. Stewie never calls Brian just a dog. To Stewie, Brian is his equal, his partner, and sometimes his savior. But even within this bond, loneliness creeps in. Stewie is still a child, even if brilliant, and their closeness cannot erase Brian's yearning for something deeper. Romantic fulfillment, intellectual acknowledgement, and a kind of belonging that transcends even the Griffin home. This yearning pushes him into countless pursuits of love, most of which end in heartbreak or awkward rejection. Each time he believes he is close to bridging the gap between his identity and the world's perception of him, and each time he is reminded of the gulf that remains. Brian's failed romances are not just comedic set pieces, but haunting reminders of his liminality. His attraction to human women is both natural within the universe of Family Guy and deeply unsettling when examined closely. It paints him as a character desperately trying to place himself fully within the human experience, reaching for validation in relationships that are rarely stable or reciprocated. Each rejection becomes a quiet whisper. You don't belong here. The heartbreak is not simply romantic. It is existential. It tells Brian again and again that the world will not grant him the space he yearns for, and no matter how refined his tastes or eloquent his words. At the same time, Brian's role in the Griffin family reinforces the paradox. He is relied upon as a voice of reason, often the one who points out Peter's absurdities, guides Lois through moral dilemmas, or provides Stewie with companionship. Yet he is never fully free of the title of dog. When the Griffins go on adventures, Brian is often left behind or treated as secondary. His voice is important, but his place is fragile. This creates a layered portrayal. Brian is central and peripheral at once, loved yet misunderstood, integral yet diminished. The dynamic keeps him forever on the edge of true belonging. This edge is where the haunting quality of his companionship lies. To the audience, Brian is relatable, precisely because he is never fully secure in his place. His identity crisis mirrors the human experience of feeling in between, whether socially, emotionally, or intellectually. Many viewers see themselves in his struggles, the fear of not being recognized, the pain of failure, the yearning for love. In this way, Brian transcends his animated form and becomes a mirror to the audience's own insecurities. His companionship with others may never fully satisfy him, but it resonates with those who understand the quiet ache of loneliness beneath laughter. The haunting continues when we examine how the world outside the Griffin family treats him. In interactions with outsiders, Brian is often dismissed or ridiculed. Quagmire's hatred is perhaps the most exaggerated example, but it serves as a reminder of how fragile Brian's place is. For every moment of intellectual triumph, there is a reminder that he is just a dog. It creates a dissonance that never resolves, a shadow that follows him wherever he goes. Companionship is offered, but never without conditions. Love is given, but always tinged with strangeness. Respect is earned, but easily revoked. This cyclical pattern of validation and rejection fuels Brian's cynicism. His critiques of society, culture, and politics are not born simply of intellectualism, but of bitterness. He mocks others because he too is mocked. He deconstructs illusions because his own are constantly shattered. In this sense, his companionship with others becomes both his salvation and his torment. He longs for it, yet it never fills the void. He clings to it, yet it often reinforces his feelings of being out of place. The haunting is not in the loss of companionship, but in the fragile, conditional nature of it. A ghostly reminder that he may never find what he seeks. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Brian's companionship arc is that he often sabotages himself. His arrogance, his self-righteousness, and his indulgences push people away. The very intellect that makes him unique also isolates him. When he drinks too much, preaches too loudly, or belittles others, he creates distance where he longs for closeness. This self-destructive pattern haunts him more than any external rejection. It suggests that Brian's loneliness is not only imposed by the world, but cultivated by his own flaws. And yet, through all of this, there remains resilience. Brian continues to try. He writes again after rejection. He seeks love again after heartbreak. He debates and converses even when ridiculed. His persistence is itself a form of hope, a refusal to accept complete exile from the human world he so desperately craves. In this persistence lies the fragile beauty of his companionship. Though haunted by loneliness, he never fully gives up on the possibility of belonging. As the candle of Brian's romantic life flickers on in the dimmed corridors of our story, we notice something remarkable. The way every failed love becomes a mirror reflecting his own insecurities. Unlike Peter, who barrels through relationships with a comedic obliviousness, Brian lingers in the aftermath. He replays moments. He wonders what he could have said differently. And in those endless rewinds, the bitterness of loss deepens. For the viewer, it feels as though we're watching a character who is at once too human for his world and too flawed to escape the traps he sets for himself. That contrast is what keeps his arc alive. Each new romance isn't just a punchline, it's a continuation of his internal struggle. We can trace this pattern to several defining storylines. Take his entanglement with Jillian, the beautiful but somewhat naive girlfriend. She represented something Brian thought he wanted: stability, companionship, perhaps even the shadow of a family life. But her simplicity, her lack of depth in conversations, clashed so dramatically with Brian's intellectual pride that he found himself alienated. Instead of nurturing the bond, he let his own arrogance poison it, until the breakup became inevitable. It wasn't Jillian's lack of sophistication that doomed them. It was Brian's inability to reconcile what he wanted on paper with what he actually needed in his heart. Then there's Brian's tangled affections for Lois, a relationship that embodies his contradictions more than almost any other. On one level, it's played for humor, the irony of a dog being in love with his best friend's wife. But beneath the laughs, it reveals something darker about Brian's loneliness. Lois, unlike the flings and casual romances, represents warmth, stability, and an unattainable dream. By projecting his longing onto her, Brian exposes his yearning for a love that is both secure and impossible. The impossibility itself feeds into the tragedy, because if the relationship cannot exist, then Brian can never truly fail at it. It becomes a safe space for his hope, even as it remains eternally unfulfilled. And then, of course, we cannot ignore Brian's more unusual encounters, the surreal romances and comedic disasters that dot his history. Each one leaves behind a trace, even if the show wraps them up quickly. Whether it's a date gone wrong because of his pretentiousness, or an almost relationship that falls apart under the weight of his insecurities, Brian keeps walking away with a wound. Some are shallow scratches, others deep gashes, but all of them accumulate. And because Brian is not like Peter or Quagmire, characters who bounce back without much reflection, these wounds linger, shaping his worldview and feeding his cynicism. Yet hidden in all these failures is something quietly profound. Each heartbreak, each rejection, chips away at Brian's certainty, but also reaffirms his humanity. Dogs in the world of Family Guy could have been background characters, mere punchlines. But Brian's search for love gives him depth far beyond the surface. He's not simply a pet. He's a soul searching for connection in a world that doesn't quite know what to make of him. It's why his storylines resonate with viewers who have felt the sting of unreciprocated affection or the frustration of chasing something just out of reach. His romances, flawed as they are, also serve as windows into the show's broader satire. When Brian courts women, we often see reflections of societal norms and cultural expectations. Sometimes the women embody exaggerated stereotypes. Sometimes they serve as foils for Brian's ego. And sometimes they expose how absurd it is for a talking dog to be entangled in human drama. But always the stories highlight the tension between Brian's self-image and reality. He wants to be seen as more than what he is, but he cannot fully escape the limitations imposed on him. This longing doesn't just define his relationships, it spills into his friendships as well. When Brian opens up to Stewie or other characters about his romantic woes, the tone shifts from satire to vulnerability. Those rare moments of honesty strip away the cynicism, showing us the raw ache of someone who desperately wants to belong. And yet the cycle continues. Brian reaches for love, stumbles, recoils into sarcasm, then dares to try again. It's this repetition, this stubborn persistence in the face of failure, that makes him such a hauntingly relatable figure. As we move deeper into Brian's story, the echoes of these romantic endeavors begin to intertwine with his broader struggle for identity. He doesn't just want a partner. He wants proof that he is more than his failures, more than his cynicism, more than the dog label that shadows him. In the quiet aftermath of breakups, when he pours himself a drink and retreats into solitude, we catch glimpses of a character who might be closer to tragedy than comedy. And yet that tragic weight is softened by humor, making his story all the more impactful. The lore we uncover here suggests that Brian's search for love is never truly about the women he dates. It's about himself. Every relationship is a reflection, every heartbreak a reminder of the walls he cannot climb. And in that, he becomes a mirror for us too, because who among us hasn't reached for something unattainable, only to find ourselves haunted by the echo of what could have been? It's in that mirror where every heartbreak becomes less about the relationship and more about Brian that the real tragedy of his lore takes shape. Because when we peel back the layers, his pursuit of love is never about finding the one, but about proving something to himself that he is capable of transcending the lonely, drifting existence he so often tries to drink away. Yet every attempt ends in the same place, with Brian alone in the shadows of his own living room, glass in hand, mulling over what could have been. That cycle defines him, and the show leans into it, because the pain feels familiar to anyone who has wrestled with unfulfilled desire. And so Brian's romances become less about companionship and more about survival. Each fling, each ill-fated relationship, is an experiment in rewriting his story. He chases after different kinds of women, intellectuals, dreamers, even women who are themselves trapped in toxic cycles, as if one of them might hold the key to solving his identity crisis. But instead of clarity, each romance hands him another contradiction, another reminder of the gap between the Brian he imagines himself to be and the Brian the world actually sees. The paradox runs deep. He is a dog who wants to be a man, a cynic who still believes in love, a moralist who constantly contradicts his own ethics. This constant friction is what makes his story more compelling than the gags that first introduced him. Because we don't just laugh at Brian when he fumbles through romance, we recognize him. His lofty speeches about art, politics, or love are always undermined by his own hypocrisy. But isn't that what makes him real? That inability to live up to one's own ideals is something that resonates far beyond animated satire. And perhaps that's why his failures feel less like comedic beats and more like milestones in a longer, sadder arc. Each woman he loses is not just a name in a long list of X's. It's another lesson in futility. Brian wants someone who will complete him, someone who will see past his ego and flaws to the beating heart underneath. But the cruel twist of his lore is that the more he searches for that validation, the further away it slips. It's not that he's unworthy of love, but that he sabotages it at every turn, because deep down, he doesn't truly believe he deserves it. This is where his companionship with Stewie becomes essential to understanding his romantic failures. For all the women who drift in and out of his life, Stewie is the one constant, the one character who listens to Brian at his most vulnerable. And while the show plays their banter for laughs, there's a deeper tenderness beneath it all. Stewie sees through Brian's pretension, calling him out when he wallows or overcomplicates his emotions. But he also offers him the kind of companionship that no romance has ever sustained. It's ironic and perhaps tragic that Brian's most enduring relationship is with a child, a relationship that defies traditional categories of love, but is rooted in mutual need. Yet even with Stewie as his anchor, Brian cannot escape his cycles of self-destruction. His drinking is the clearest sign of that downward spiral. Alcohol becomes both a prop and a shield, something to steady him when the weight of his failures becomes unbearable. The wine glass is practically an extension of his character, a silent witness to his confessions, his ramblings, and his despair. It's not just a comedic device. It's a symbol of how Brian numbs himself against the ache of unmet desire. And in that symbolism lies a truth the show rarely says outright. Brian is addicted not only to alcohol, but to the pain of longing itself. Think about it. If Brian were ever truly fulfilled, if he ever found the perfect romance, would he still be Brian? The show seems to suggest the answer is no. His identity is bound to the cycle of yearning, stumbling, and recovering just enough to try again. Love for Brian is less a destination and more a loop he can't escape. It defines him, tortures him, and sustains him all at once. And in the quiet rhythm of that loop, there's a strange beauty, because even though he fails again and again, Brian keeps trying. He never completely gives up on the idea that love might save him. That persistence, even when it leads to ruin, gives him a flicker of hope that softens his otherwise cynical character. We see it when he risks embarrassment by confessing his feelings, when he pours his heart into grand gestures that inevitably backfire, when he dreams, just for a moment, of a life where he isn't alone. These moments, scattered throughout his lore, are what elevate him from parody to poignancy. They remind us that even in comedy, even in the exaggerated absurdity of a talking dog's romantic struggles, there can be real human truth. The truth that sometimes love is not a cure but a mirror. That sometimes we search for others to validate us because we cannot validate ourselves. And that sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't being unloved, but being unable to love ourselves enough to accept love when it's offered. Brian's story, then, is not about romance as much as it is about identity. His failed relationships are metaphors for his deeper alienation, his inability to reconcile who he is with who he wants to be. Every time he loses someone, the gap between those identities widens, and he drowns it in sarcasm and scotch. But beneath it all, there is still a flicker of yearning, a hope that one day he might bridge that gap. And perhaps that's why his lore lingers so strongly in the minds of viewers. Because while the other characters in Family Guy orbit around gags and absurdity, Brian anchors himself in something far more fragile: hope. Hope that love will finally make him whole, even though he knows somewhere deep down that it never truly will. So as Chapter 3 closes, we leave Brian at that familiar crossroads. A dog with a heart full of human longing, a lover who never quite finds love, a cynic who can't stop hoping. His romances, tragic and comedic, are not just background details. They are the architecture of his entire existence. They reveal a soul that is never satisfied, always reaching, always stumbling, but never fully giving up. And in that endless reaching, Brian's lore becomes something hauntingly beautiful. Because love for Brian isn't about happy endings. It's about the search itself, the endless, painful, hopeful search. And as we move into the next chapter, we'll see how that search bleeds into the rest of his identity, not just in romance, but in his philosophies, his ideals, his friendships, and the darker paths he walks when hope begins to fade. For now, though, we can close this chapter with the image of Brian sitting quietly, glass in hand, his eyes cast toward the distance, imagining a future that never comes, but still daring to imagine it all the same. The house grew silent again, and the echoes of what had just been uncovered lingered like dust suspended in still air. Quahog was beginning to feel less like a town and more like a shadowy labyrinth, with each turn revealing a passageway into something the people weren't meant to see. The ordinary, brightly lit facades, the diners, the town hall, the suburban homes, were only surface decorations, painted carefully over a foundation of secrets that breathed beneath. And as we push further, the streets begin to blur into something darker. It is here that we step into the next thread of Quahog's hidden story, where old structures, forgotten basements, and sealed-off corridors tell their own version of history, one that doesn't match the official records. To understand this part of Quahog's tale, you need to picture the town at its quietest, past midnight, when the air cools and not even the dogs bark. The lamps that line Spooner Street flicker just faintly, and the rest of the neighborhood folds into a curtain of dimness. That's when you notice the details that daylight washes away. A fence that doesn't quite match the houses beside it. A patch of ground that dips ever so slightly as if something below is collapsing. Or an alleyway that feels far longer than it looks. These are the entry points, the signals that beneath Quahog's familiar surface is an undercurrent of unfinished stories. One such unfinished story lies beneath the town's old movie theater. Today, most people think of the Quahog Theater as a second-rate spot, a place where movies arrive late, and the popcorn machine is always one repair away from shutting down. But if you trace back through its blueprints, if you pull up the archived newspapers from decades past, the story changes. The theater wasn't just a theater. It was originally built over something else, something never intended for public eyes. The foundations beneath the theater belonged to a network of passageways, carved out before the building was even laid. They weren't tunnels in the typical sense. They weren't meant for trains, for cargo, or even for safe passage. Instead, they appear to have been chambers, elongated rooms cut into the ground, connected by narrow shafts that don't make sense in practical terms. There are no proper ventilation systems, no logical structural supports, no reason they should still stand, yet somehow they do. For years, whispers circulated about these underground rooms, but the theater became the cover, an unassuming mask that drew the community's focus upward while shadows lingered below. The mystery deepens when you look at old police records from the 1950s, long before the theater was renovated into the version we see now. There were accounts of break-ins, not into the theater itself, but into locked storage spaces beneath it. The reports describe unexplainable drafts of cold air, unsettling echoes that did not correspond with the number of people present, and most disturbingly, markings etched into the walls that did not resemble letters from any known alphabet. These accounts are few, sparse, and scattered, but they form a trail, a breadcrumb path that leads us to what Quahog tries not to remember. What makes the underground theater chambers more haunting is their strange connection to the town's missing persons reports. The 1960s and 70s saw spikes in disappearances, mostly drifters, out-of-towners, and people no one in Quahog really noticed were gone. Local authorities chalked it up to coincidence, a statistical blip. But if you overlay the map of those disappearances with the underground theater's blueprints, something chilling emerges. Nearly every reported disappearance occurred within walking distance of the theater. And while correlation isn't proof, the timing and geography line up too neatly to ignore. Step back into present-day Quahog, and you'll realize most residents have no clue about any of this. They buy their tickets, sit in their seats, and groan at the broken soda machine, completely unaware of the forgotten chambers beneath their feet. Yet every now and then people mention odd occurrences, a seat that feels colder than the rest of the row, footsteps behind them when the aisles are empty, or a faint whisper that comes just as the end credits roll. These details never make it into the public discourse. They stay confined to quiet conversations, the kinds of stories friends share on late nights when the mood is just right. But for those who venture deeper, maintenance staff, urban explorers, or curious thrill seekers, the accounts grow stranger still. One retired janitor recalls finding a sealed hatch beneath the boiler room, locked with heavy iron bolts that looked older than the building itself. He remembers the feeling of standing above it, the air around him turning colder, the hair on his arms rising, and the sensation that whatever was beneath that hatch was aware of him standing there. He reported it to his manager, but by the next week the hatch was gone, as if it had never existed. The floor was resealed, concrete smoothed over, and the janitor was warned not to bring it up again if he wanted to keep his job. The theater is just one piece of Quahog's hidden geography. Step outside, follow the narrow back roads that wind past forgotten storefronts, and you'll find other spaces like this, abandoned foundations, half-buried basements, and incomplete structures that remain long after their original purpose vanished. Some connect through old sewer lines, others through crude passageways no city records acknowledge. Together, they form a web, a hidden map of Quahog that runs parallel to the one we know. And as unsettling as it may be, it feels less like coincidence and more like design. Who built these structures? Why were they left unfinished? And more importantly, why were they hidden? These questions don't come with easy answers. Theories range from Prohibition-era smuggling routes to secret meeting spots for fraternal lodges, but even those explanations don't account for the sheer oddness of the architecture. The shapes carved underground don't align with practicality. They align with symbols, with ritual, with intention. The eerie part is how ordinary Quahog feels above these spaces. Families laugh over dinner, children play in the streets, and couples walk hand in hand past the glowing diner signs. Yet beneath that surface normalcy, there's something waiting, preserved in concrete and soil, a silent reminder that Quahog's story isn't just written in daylight, it's carved into the dark too. And so, as we step further into this chapter of Quahog's hidden tale, we aren't just exploring history, we're tracing the contours of an unfinished design, one that continues to breathe through the cracks in the town's surface. The river whispered on as if carrying its burden of secrets away from Quahog and into the vast unknown. But the townsfolk, huddled in their homes or walking hurriedly down dim streets, always knew that the river gave back more than it took. Stories of strange things surfacing at night were passed down quietly, rarely spoken of openly, yet never forgotten. And as the weight of these whispers grew heavier, The shadows of the town itself began to feel as though they had a pulse of their own. It was during one of Quahog's power outages, a common enough occurrence whenever the skies cracked with thunder, that these whispers seemed to find form. The town fell into complete darkness, and the only lights that flickered were those from candles hurriedly placed in windows. Yet as families sat together in uneasy silence, some swore they could hear voices drifting in from outside, voices not belonging to neighbors, but to something older, something waiting. Take the Griffin household, for example. The family sat in their living room, Stewie clutching Rupert tighter than usual, his sharp little mind processing every creak of the house with suspicion. Brian lay at his side, ears twitching as though he were tuned into some frequency that no one else could hear. Peter, of course, tried to ease the tension with jokes, fumbling through another story of his high school days, but even his laughter seemed muffled, swallowed up by the dark corners of the room. Lois, though steady, found herself glancing at the curtained windows more than once, wondering if someone, or something, was standing just outside, peering in. The blackout stretched longer than usual, and with it came a sound that many later claimed they'd heard, but no one dared admit until morning. A low humming, like a voice caught between worlds, weaving its way through the streets of Quahog. Some described it as a chant, others as a lullaby that carried an edge of warning. To the children of Spooner Street, it sounded like a song just for them, and several admitted, much later, that they had dreamt of following it into the woods beyond the edge of town. The woods, Quahog's silent sentinels, had always carried their own set of stories. They were the kind of trees that seemed to grow closer together as you walked deeper, the canopy thick enough to blot out moonlight. Kids dared each other to enter, but most never went beyond a few steps, unnerved by the silence that always seemed to fall there. But the blackout song gave the woods a voice. Parents claimed they saw faint glows moving between the trunks that night, not lanterns, not flashlights, but orbs, drifting silently like sparks from some great unseen fire. The morning after, Quahog woke unsettled. The blackout had ended, but traces of what had happened lingered. A few people claimed that items had shifted in their homes. A chair moved slightly, a window left ajar despite being shut tight before bed. The Griffin house, too, bore strange marks. Stewie discovered a set of muddy prints leading up to the back door, prints far too small for an adult, yet oddly misshapen, as though made by someone whose shoes didn't quite fit. He said nothing to Lois, nothing to Brian, instead quietly analyzing them on his own. But even the baby genius couldn't shake the feeling that the prints weren't left by anything human. Stories spread fast in Quahog, and by the end of that day, many agreed that the blackout had been more than an accident. The town's older residents exchanged nervous glances when asked about it, their silence louder than words. They had lived through such things before, decades ago. But speaking of it always seemed to invite something back into their lives. And so the whispers shifted again, this time focusing on a building most tried to ignore, the old mill, abandoned long before most families in Quahog had even moved in. Once a heartbeat of the town's economy, it now stood rotting by the river's edge, windows broken, roof sagging. Everyone avoided it, yet everyone seemed to look toward it when strange events arose, as though it were somehow the anchor that held Quahog's hidden darkness. One boy claimed that during the blackout he saw lights flickering inside the mill, far too steady to be lanterns, far too cold to be fire. Another swore that he saw figures moving behind the shattered glass, pacing slowly as if waiting for someone to notice. The children who spoke of this were hushed quickly by their parents, told not to repeat it, told not to give power to such stories. Yet stories have a way of surviving, passed in whispers when adults aren't listening. Stewie, ever curious, had already turned his mind toward the mill. The footprints at his home, the glow in the woods, the unsettling song, they all seemed to point in the same direction. But what disturbed him most was Brian's behavior. The dog, usually cynical and quick with his own brand of skepticism, seemed genuinely rattled. He spent the entire day pacing the house, ears constantly flicking, eyes darting toward the back door as though expecting someone to knock. Brian had heard something during the blackout, something he couldn't explain, and though he refused to speak of it openly, Stewie caught the rare vulnerability in his eyes. It was Lois who tried to put it all to rest, insisting the family stop talking about the blackout, stop feeding the nonsense that floated through town. She reminded them that power outages were common, that stress and imagination could explain the rest. But even she couldn't hide her unease, especially when she discovered the basement light had been left on overnight, though she swore she'd switched it off before the outage began. That night, Quahog tried to settle back into its routines. The bars reopened, the shops bustled, the usual gossip returned. Yet, as evening fell, a subtle shift took place. The air grew heavier, the breeze colder, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Few dared mention it, but many felt it. The sense that something had stirred during the blackout and was now watching, waiting, deciding when to return. The shadows of Quahog's older neighborhoods were not simply accidents of poor lighting or the long reach of colonial-era lamplight. They carried the weight of stories that seemed to breathe between the cracks of the cobblestone streets and sigh through the thin walls of clapboard houses. It was here, in these forgotten veins of the town, that Quahog's pulse beat with a rhythm older than its people. The Griffin family, like most who passed through the modern day, never lingered on these stories long enough to notice how the silence seemed to press against the skin. But silence in Quahog was rarely empty. It was filled with the residue of things unspoken, of warnings left unsaid, and of memories etched deep into the town itself. And as that silence deepened, one figure became increasingly central in the lore whispered beneath the surface. Not a Griffin, not a Swanson, nor even one of the eccentric townsfolk that peppered Quahog's streets, but rather the town itself, as if Quahog had a personality, a desire, and an unshakable need to remind its inhabitants that they were only temporary guests. The lore of Quahog's first graveyard was always a starting point for those willing to listen. It sat tucked behind St. Augustine's Chapel, a modest plot of land choked by ivy and neglected by all but the bravest teens seeking a thrill. The stones tilted at odd angles, inscriptions worn to whispers by centuries of rain and frost. But beneath them, it was said, was not merely the rest of those who had come before, but a foundation of secrecy that anchored the town itself. Some believed that Quahog's first families had entered into a pact, a binding agreement to settle here in exchange for protection from forces that stalked the New England wilderness. What made the story peculiar was not its content. After all, New England teemed with legends of pacts and bargains, but its persistence. Every generation, someone would rediscover fragments, an old diary in an attic trunk, a parish record with missing lines, or a journal hastily buried beneath floorboards. They never aligned neatly. They contradicted each other as if trying to tell the truth, while something larger scrambled the details. But always one thread remained constant. Quahog was chosen, and it had never been free since. The unsettling part, however, wasn't just the pact. It was the idea that Quahog itself could choose. Could a town be alive? Could it hunger? Residents would laugh off such notions, but then they would shudder at the inexplicable feeling that certain streets always seemed colder, certain corners darker, even when bathed in daylight. They would look at their homes and wonder why drafts crept in at the same hours every night, carrying with them the faint scent of salt water, even miles inland. That unease was no accident. It was tied to the sea. The earliest settlers had arrived by way of a coast both hostile and alluring. Fishermen had written in logs about strange shapes cresting the waves, shapes they swore weren't whales or common sea creatures. They spoke of eyes reflecting lantern light, far too high above the water to belong to anything earthly. When storms rolled in, they came sudden and furious, as though summoned deliberately. And afterward, carcasses would wash ashore, unrecognizable, decayed far faster than natural, with bones that didn't fit any anatomy known to man. The locals learned quickly not to question, and those who did often vanished, leaving behind only unanswered echoes. Brian and Stewie had brushed against these kinds of tales before, without realizing their depth. In the eerie calm after their own chaotic adventures, Brian had once joked that Quahog seemed cursed, a magnet for absurdity. Stewie, of course, mocked him, preferring the rational comforts of his science. But the truth lingered underneath Brian's comment. Quahog was not absurd by accident. It was absurd because it had been marked, tugged at, reshaped by centuries of secrets that refused to stay buried. Consider the tale of the mariner's bell. For generations, fishermen in Quahog passed down the story of a bell that would ring, unseen and unheard by outsiders, whenever a death at sea was imminent. Some swore they heard it in their sleep, others only when the fog thickened. The last recorded time anyone mentioned hearing it was in the late 1800s, when a whaling vessel vanished without a trace just miles from the shore. The bell rang 3 nights in a row, echoing through the town, though no physical bell was ever found. Then there was this strange architecture. Historians, trying to catalog Quahog's earliest buildings, noted dimensions that made little sense, measurements that seemed to defy consistency. Some houses appeared larger on the inside than the outside would allow. Staircases led nowhere. Windows opened to walls, and in the basements, crude carvings lined the stone, symbols that had no clear origin. Residents dismissed them as idle graffiti from bored children, though no child ever confessed. And yet, with all these scattered fragments of horror, the townspeople carried on, perhaps too eager to normalize the strange. Life in Quahog was saturated with jokes, parody, and surreal antics, which only made the darker truths easier to overlook. But to those who peered closely, those willing to let their minds wander in the silence, the absurdity seemed less like coincidence and more like camouflage. What better way to hide centuries of unease than beneath a constant barrage of laughter? The Griffin household itself was not untouched by these echoes. Their house, perched on Spooner Street, had foundations that ran deeper than anyone realized. During renovations in the 1960s, workers claimed to have found tunnels beneath the property, narrow passages that led nowhere and collapsed on themselves. The records of those findings disappeared soon after, and the workers refused to speak of them. Today, the Griffins moved freely in and out of their home, never knowing that every step was taken on ground that might still whisper secrets into their dreams. And in those dreams lay the true danger. Quahog had a way of bleeding into the subconscious. Townsfolk across generations reported eerily similar dreams. Visions of endless water swallowing the streets, voices whispering beneath floorboards, or the sensation of being pulled into walls that breathed. They dismissed them as nightmares, coincidental overlaps. But diaries preserved in the town's historical society showed that these dreams repeated across centuries, long before modern media could have seeded such ideas. This shared dreaming suggested something even more unnerving. The Quahog didn't just haunt its people in waking life. It reached into their minds at night, ensuring that, even in rest, no one truly escaped its presence. And if the town could weave itself into the subconscious, what else could it alter? Memory? Perception? The line between dream and reality. As these unsettling details accumulated, a picture emerged that was difficult to deny. Quahog was not merely a backdrop, it was a participant, an active force that shaped its people and demanded their silence. Brian and Stewie, though still skeptical, had begun brushing against these truths more directly than anyone in their generation. Their adventures weren't just coincidences of cartoon randomness. They were interactions with a town whose very identity was entangled with the uncanny. And as night crept back over Spooner Street, the silence once again pressed heavy, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to acknowledge the weight of what Quahog really was. It was as if the very air around Quahog shifted. The whispers in the wind grew softer, but their intent more piercing. Each word, though indistinct, carried an ancient weight, as though generations of untold stories pressed down upon the town's foundations. Those who dared to walk the darker streets at night found themselves glancing over their shoulders more often, convinced that unseen eyes trailed their every step. The ordinary lamplight flickered unpredictably, as if unseen hands toyed with the bulbs, reminding the living that their comforts were fragile, temporary, and vulnerable to something much older than electricity or convenience. The Griffin household itself began to show signs of the strain. Lois moved through the house like she carried an invisible burden, straightening cushions, wiping down counters, but always pausing near the windows at odd hours. She would catch her reflection in the glass, and for a fleeting moment, swear she saw someone else staring back. Not herself, not a trick of the light, but a face pale and shadowed, features blurred yet disturbingly intent. Stewie noticed too. He didn't comment directly. After all, a mind as sharp as his preferred to catalog details quietly before exposing truths. But he scribbled his observations in his notebook late at night, hunched beneath his blanket with a dim flashlight. Each page filled with theories, the possibility of dimensional rifts, psychic disturbances, even the idea that Quahog sat on land once cursed by forgotten rituals. Brian, meanwhile, grew restless. He would pace the hallways at night, claws clicking against hardwood as his ears twitched at sounds no one else seemed to hear. A creak in the attic, a sigh from beneath the floorboards, a scratching against the outer siding of the house when no branches could possibly reach. Sometimes he growled softly, not to scare but to warn, as if instinct reminded him that the divide between the world of the living and the world of the forgotten was thinning. He didn't tell the others much. What good would it do to frighten them? But inside, he knew he was slowly losing sleep, and worse, losing patience. As this tension built, Peter found himself at the Drunken Clam more often. But even the clam wasn't immune. The warm, golden glow of its neon sign flickered like a dying heartbeat. Inside, the regular chatter dipped lower than usual, as if the men of Quahog themselves had subconsciously agreed to keep their voices down, wary of something that might overhear. Quagmire joked less, his usual crude remarks stuttering into half-hearted murmurs before trailing off into silence. Even Cleveland admitted over his drink that he'd been dreaming of the same faceless figures night after night. The dreams were spreading. In these visions, townsfolk would wander through fog-drenched streets of Quahog. The familiar houses and shops stood there, but distorted, their proportions wrong, angles sharper than they should be, windows like empty sockets staring back at them. Sometimes they would hear children's laughter echoing from alleys, laughter that cut off suddenly, replaced by shrieks. Other times they saw figures standing just beyond the fog's veil, tall, motionless, waiting. And then, as they awoke, they realized the dream hadn't ended. For a split second before full consciousness pulled them back, they would see the same pale figures at the foot of their beds, dissolving like smoke into the shadows. Reports began circulating quietly in the town. People didn't announce it openly, but gossip slipped through hushed conversations at the grocery store, the gas station, and church pews. Someone swore they saw shadows stretching unnaturally long down Main Street, stretching farther than the light should allow. Another claimed to hear an entire chorus humming near the old mill, though no one was there. And then came the most chilling account. A group of kids dared each other to spend the night near the cemetery. By morning, they returned shaken, all refusing to speak of what they'd seen. One dropped his flashlight on the grass that night, and when it was found the next day, the casing had warped, melted as though exposed to extreme heat, though no fire had touched the ground. It was Stewie who began connecting the pieces most efficiently. He charted a map of Quahog on his bedroom floor, marking each strange occurrence with colored pins. Soon a pattern emerged, everything aligned in a perfect spiral, converging toward a single spot in town. The abandoned clock tower. Long forgotten, covered in ivy and left to rot since a storm decades earlier damaged its structure, the tower now stood as a silent sentinel at the town's edge. Few ever ventured near it, but Stewie knew better than to dismiss the symbolism. Spirals meant focus, meant something pulling everything inward like water down a drain. And if the town itself was the water, then whatever lay beneath the clock tower was waiting at the center. Brian, listening to Stewie's deductions, could only shake his head in weary agreement. The dog's instincts told him the same thing. This wasn't random. The restless energy, the dreams, the whispers, they were pointing somewhere. It was like being on the cusp of a storm. You could smell the rain before it fell, feel the static before lightning struck. The clock tower was their storm's eye. Meanwhile, Lois tried to hold her family together, but she couldn't ignore the shift in her children. Meg, usually overlooked, seemed almost hyper-aware now. She admitted to Lois that she could hear knocking in her walls at night, slow, deliberate, and never from the same spot twice. Chris began sketching bizarre shapes, eyes upon eyes, spirals within spirals, as though his subconscious couldn't contain the visions. Lois comforted them, but at night she cried quietly, pressing her face into her pillow so Peter wouldn't hear. She didn't want to believe the rumors. She didn't want to think their town, their home, was unraveling into something unrecognizable. Yet the evidence grew undeniable. The very heartbeat of Quahog seemed off rhythm, its nights longer, its shadows thicker, and its silence no longer a comfort but a threat. And as the Griffin family braced themselves, somewhere beyond the fog-choked town square, the old clock tower's gears stirred faintly, grinding against rust as if awakened by the attention. Its chimes, long silent, seemed ready to toll again. The sense was clear. Quahog was no longer simply haunted. It was being claimed. The silence of Quahog's abandoned corners deepened, as though the town itself had drawn in a sharp breath and was holding it. The shadows seemed heavier now, not merely patches of absence, but living curtains through which something unseen might step at any moment. We had lingered long on the stories hidden behind the facades of family homes, forgotten churches and boarded shops, But the journey was far from over. Brian and Stewie's slow trek through this ghostly version of Quahog was taking them deeper than they had ever dared to go, into the marrow of their own fears. The next steps they took would not just lead into another empty building, but into an encounter with the lingering energies that bound Quahog to its restless past. And so the next tale unfolded. It began with the cracked remains of Quahog's original town hall, an older, smaller building, buried behind municipal developments, now almost lost to time. No lights had shone from its windows in decades, yet the faint impression of candlelit meetings and hushed gatherings still clung to its rotting frame. The wooden beams creaked under the strain of their own decay, yet inside, the whispers remained crisp, replaying endlessly in the dusty air. Brian paused as they entered, his ears twitching. It wasn't the wind, he knew that much. It was the murmur of voices long gone. Stewie, holding his toy ray gun tightly, squinted into the shadows, trying to pin the sound to its source. The story passed down about this building was different from others. It wasn't tied to a single tragedy, but rather to the fabric of decision-making itself. This hall had once been the beating heart of Quahog, where every choice about the town's growth, its laws, and its people was made. The ghost stories whispered that the walls themselves had absorbed these choices, and now every betrayal, every injustice, every corrupt deal lingered here, thickening the air into something almost tangible. Those who wandered in after dark claimed to hear not footsteps or laughter, but arguments, heated, endless, unresolved debates, echoing against the plaster like a phantom council that would never adjourn. Brian and Stewie stood in the heart of the room, where the old council table, warped with age, still stretched out. Its wood gleamed faintly in the pale moonlight through a broken window. And then it began. The voices rose, invisible but sharp, like glass splintering in their ears. Stewie clutched his head as the sound pressed inward, a chorus of shouts layering over one another, accusations of theft, cries of betrayal, and bitter declarations of greed. It was chaos given voice, looping without end. For a moment, Brian thought he saw figures, men and women dressed in outdated Quahog fashion, sleeves rolled up, faces red with anger, pounding their fists on the table. They flickered like candle flames, half there, half smoke, yet their intensity was undeniable. Brian could feel their fury. He realized suddenly that these weren't just echoes of meetings. They were the leftover rage of those who had sold pieces of Quahog's soul for personal gain. Every corrupt handshake, every hushed promise exchanged in that chamber, still vibrated through the bones of the building. Stewie's small frame trembled as he tried to shut the noise out. It's like they're trying to pull us in, he whispered, his voice unusually small, and indeed, the longer they stood there, the more the voices seemed to demand their participation, as if Brian and Stewie had become unwilling members of the spectral council. Brian tugged Stewie away, and the moment they stepped beyond the table's edge, the sound faded to a dull murmur, like waves on a distant shore. They exchanged a glance. This was no ordinary haunting. It was a reminder that corruption lingers long after the people involved are gone. Quahog's ghosts weren't always born from violence. Sometimes they were birthed by decisions, by greed, by moments when morality had been cast aside. As they left the hall, the moonlight glinted over the town in fractured beams, and a deeper realization sank in. Quahog was more than a place of comedy and absurdity. Beneath it lay layers of history soaked in bitterness, betrayal, and the slow corrosion of community spirit. This town was haunted not just by apparitions, but by the consequences of its own choices. They walked in silence until they reached another landmark, the long-forgotten riverside warehouse. Unlike the whimsical, cartoonish structures that usually peppered Quahog's skyline, this place was heavy, brutal in its design, a box of iron and brick that seemed to absorb every ray of light before swallowing it whole. The windows were blackened, shattered in some places, and the doors groaned like beasts chained too long. Brian hesitated before entering. Something about this place prickled against his instincts, deeper even than fear. Stewie noticed the hesitation and smirked faintly, though his eyes betrayed unease. "What's the matter, Brian? Afraid of a little industrial gloom?" he whispered, but his voice quivered. Inside, the air was sharp and metallic, heavy with the scent of rust and something older, something faintly sweet and decayed. The warehouse had been the site of labor disputes, whispered smuggling, and hushed accidents that were never fully recorded in Quahog's history. The stories said that men who had worked here had vanished, their names forgotten, their families left in silence. No investigation had ever dug deep, because the warehouse was tied to too many powerful hands at the time. And so the ghosts stayed. Brian's footsteps echoed hollowly as they entered. But another rhythm soon followed, a dragging sound, faint and slow, like chains pulled across the floor. His ears pinned back, and he turned sharply, only to find the shadows lengthening behind them, twisting into shapes. Stewie raised his toy weapon instinctively, but no form took full shape. Instead, it was the sound that thickened. The creak of ropes, the moans of effort, the sickening thud of something heavy falling. The warehouse replayed its tragedies endlessly, forcing those who entered to bear witness. Brian and Stewie could feel the weight of eyes on them, workers perhaps, or smugglers, or both, staring from corners just out of reach. The sensation wasn't violent, but it was suffocating, as though grief itself had been baked into the mortar. Brian urged them toward the far door, and as they stepped back into the night, Stewie turned one last time. For a moment, he swore he saw figures standing in the shadows of the loading dock, a man in work clothes, face hollow, watching silently. And then he was gone. The night pressed closer, and as Brian and Stewie walked further down the abandoned stretch of road, the realization grew heavier. Quahog wasn't merely haunted by odd spirits. It was a tapestry of memories, broken, unresolved, unfinished, that refused to let go. The deeper they went, the more it felt as though the town was waiting for them specifically, as if their presence had awakened something old, something eager to finally be seen. And this was only the beginning of what Quahog had hidden in its bones. The echoes of Quahog's silence still lingered, like a half-forgotten dream that clung to the edges of the mind even after waking. The story had been inching closer and closer to something darker, something layered beneath the usual laughter, and as the last ripples of Chapter 4 dissolved, the thread of the tale refused to let go. It was here, in this strange overlap between shadow and familiarity, that the world of the Griffins began to bend in ways most people would never notice, unless they were listening closely or peering through the cracks of the everyday fabric of Family Guy's world. And so the focus shifts again, not to the sweeping chaos of the entire Griffin household, nor to the lingering mysteries haunting Stewie and Brian, but instead to the subtle, creeping influence of things unsaid and unseen. Quahog, despite all its brightness and daylight, carries with it an undertone that few dare to acknowledge. Its neighborhoods are painted with sitcom colors, yet its nights stretch far beyond the laughter. Beneath the comfortable, looping rhythm of cutaway gags lies a texture woven with unease, as if the laughter itself has always been masking something older, stranger, and more patient. In the Griffin home, there are rooms rarely explored, hallways that seem longer in the dark than they do in the day, and closets that creak open with more weight than their hinges should allow. It is not just the house, it is the entire rhythm of Quahog. Something about the town feels cyclical, like its people are endlessly repeating themselves, like the punchlines reset the clock but never move it forward. And within this loop, strange shadows gather at the edges. On one such night, Lois Griffin found herself walking through the dim kitchen, long after everyone had gone to bed. The hum of the refrigerator was steady, familiar, grounding, yet the shadows seemed thicker that night, clinging around the corners of the cabinets. She wasn't there for a glass of water or a late-night snack. She wasn't even sure why she had gotten up. It was more like a pull, a silent nudge, the kind you don't argue with because it feels older than reason. She glanced at the family photos pinned on the fridge, the smiling faces of Peter, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and even Brian. Their expressions seemed ordinary at first, but the longer she looked, the more they felt fixed, unmoving. The kind of smiles that didn't belong to a captured moment, but to something staged, frozen. She blinked and looked away, telling herself it was just the shadows, just exhaustion. Still, she felt the lingering unease as she poured herself a glass of water. And in the silence, for just a second, she swore she heard the faintest laugh track. Not coming from the TV, not from anywhere in the house, but from somewhere else entirely. This kind of strangeness wasn't new. Every member of the Griffin family, in their own way, had brushed against the bizarre fabric that held their reality together. Stewie, of course, had always sensed it most clearly. His experiments, his time travel, his sharp intellect, they had all shown him glimpses of things beyond the ordinary. But the others, they too had felt moments where the curtain of their reality seemed thin. Chris's dreams, Meg's long silences, Brian's existential spirals, Lois's late-night wanderings, and Peter's inexplicable ability to bend reality itself through sheer absurdity. They were all symptoms of something larger, something waiting to be acknowledged. And in the background of it all, Quahog continued as if untouched. The drunken clan welcomed its late-night regulars. Mort's pharmacy lit up with its quiet fluorescent glow, and Tom Tucker's polished voice reported the news no one ever seemed to question. But the truth was, Quahog wasn't just a backdrop. It was alive. It pulsed, it shifted, and it remembered. That night, when Lois finally returned to bed, she lay awake beside Peter, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling fan turned in its steady rhythm, casting faint shadows across the room. And she thought, not for the first time, about the way days seemed to blur together in this house. The way everything always reset. The way nothing truly changed. It was the thought that lived at the edge of her mind, always pushed away before it could settle. But this night, she let it linger, because deep down she knew she wasn't imagining it. Meanwhile, Stewie had been busy again. His nursery was cluttered with half-built gadgets, scattered blueprints, and the faint hum of machines too advanced for his age. But unlike his usual missions of domination or travel, this time his obsession had been quieter, more inward. He had noticed the patterns, too, how every week, no matter the chaos, things returned to their baseline, how death itself had little permanence, how pain was never more than temporary. It was as if Quahog was caught in a loop, endlessly recycling itself, erasing consequences as soon as they appeared. And Stewie, for all his intellect, couldn't decide if that made them blessed or cursed. He tapped his tiny fingers against the desk, staring at a device half-assembled. It wasn't a weapon, not this time. It was a detector, something that could trace the echoes he had started noticing, faint imprints of events that shouldn't exist anymore, but somehow did. A sound, a shadow, a ripple in the air, like a record skipping, like reality itself glitching. And he had begun to wonder, if he followed those echoes to their source, what would he find? Brian, ever the skeptic, had dismissed Stewie's ramblings as paranoia. But late at night, alone with his glass of scotch, Brian, too, had felt it. He had stared at the moonlit backyard and wondered why he couldn't remember what had happened last Tuesday. Or was it last Thursday? He could recall fragments, sure, but they slipped together too easily, like recycled memories patched to form a whole. And so, whether they admitted it or not, each of them was feeling the edges of the same mystery. Quahog wasn't simply a town, it was a stage, and the walls of that stage were beginning to crack. The story begins here in earnest, not in a sudden burst of horror, but in the quiet recognition of patterns too perfect to ignore. The Griffins were about to stumble into something they had lived with all along, but had never dared to confront. The audience, too, had felt it. The endless loops, the impossible returns, the way characters lived and died only to walk again as if nothing had happened. But now, the family itself was on the verge of noticing. Lois turned in her bed and whispered to herself, "What if this isn't real?" The question vanished into the dark, unheard by Peter, but it lingered in the room like a scent. The first signs had already begun. The clocks in the Griffin house ticked slightly out of sync, their hands trembling just before they struck the hour. The lights flickered, not from faulty wiring, but as if someone was dimming them deliberately, watching the effect. And in the corners of their eyes, each member of the family occasionally saw something. A shadow too tall, a figure too still, a face that looked familiar but wrong. The laughter of Quahog, the endless rhythm of its gags and absurdities, was starting to thin, and in its place, a quieter sound was slipping through, the kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, but pressure, the kind of silence that makes you aware you're being observed. For the Griffins, this was only the beginning. And though the next day would seem ordinary on the surface, something had shifted in the balance. The illusion was cracking, and the weight of what lay beneath was pressing harder against the surface. The Griffin household felt strangely alive that night. The wooden bones of the house creaking and whispering in patterns that suggested more than simple aging. After all, this was no ordinary home. The walls had listened to years of laughter, violence, whispered confessions, and forgotten memories. But under the low light, something about the air shifted. What had once been familiar became alien, uncanny, as though a veil had lifted, and the true face of the house was beginning to show itself. Brian adjusted his gaze toward the flickering lamp in the living room. He was not a dog in this moment, but more like a weary scholar, watching the way shadows danced in unpredictable rhythms. Stewie sat cross-legged beside him, the boy's oversized head casting a warped outline against the wallpaper. His voice, uncharacteristically low, cut through the silence. "Do you feel that, Brian? It's as if the house is breathing." Brian didn't answer immediately because he had felt it too. The faint rush of air against his fur wasn't coming from any open window or vent. It was steady, rhythmic, like the exhale of something unseen. A nervous laugh tried to rise in his chest, but he suppressed it, aware that acknowledging it would make it real. The two of them knew deep down that this wasn't just a trick of nerves or imagination. They were tapping into something old, something that had always been here, waiting. Stewie, curious as ever, rose to his feet, and padded toward the staircase. Each step he took seemed amplified, wood groaning beneath his weight, though he was only a child. The house responded as though it wanted to warn him or perhaps encourage him to go further. Brian followed reluctantly, his paws clicking against the floorboards, his heart heavier than he wanted to admit. When they reached the landing, the upstairs hallway stretched before them in a way it never had before. The familiar corridor seemed elongated, its end fading into shadow that was darker than the natural gloom. Photographs lined the walls, family moments framed in time. But when Brian looked closely, he felt his throat tighten. The faces were wrong. Lois's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Peter's grin looked unnervingly wide. Meg's eyes seemed hollow, pits of darkness that suggested an emptiness more profound than mere angst. And Chris's photograph had been smudged, his face distorted beyond recognition, as though someone had dragged their fingers across wet paint. Stewie studied the photographs carefully, tilting his head like a scientist analyzing a specimen. "It's us, but not us," he whispered. "A record of the family as it exists in another place. Another dimension, perhaps. A place where the masks are off." Brian wanted to turn back, but Stewie pressed forward, guided by some unseen pull. They walked until they reached the attic door, a door Brian had rarely noticed in all his time with the Griffins. It wasn't locked, though it should have been. Stewie reached for the knob, and as his small hand made contact, the metal felt warm, almost alive. When the door creaked open, a heavy smell poured out, a blend of dust, damp wood, and something coppery that made Brian's stomach twist. The attic stairs stretched upward, disappearing into thick shadow, yet they climbed as if compelled, neither able to resist. Inside, the attic was not what they expected. Instead of the clutter of forgotten belongings, there was space, too much space. The attic was vast, impossibly so, stretching far beyond the boundaries of the house. The ceiling seemed lost in darkness, and the floorboards stretched endlessly, cracked and uneven. In the center of the room stood a mirror, tall and freestanding, its frame ornate with curling, almost serpentine designs. Stewie approached first, his reflection rippling unnaturally, as though the glass were made of water. His mirrored self didn't mimic his movements correctly. When Stewie tilted his head, the reflection lagged, moving a second too late. When he raised a hand, the reflection smiled back, but the smile was wider, sharper, crueler. Brian stood behind him, dread pressing against his ribs. He saw his own reflection too, but it wasn't him. The Brian in the glass was hunched, gaunt, his fur patchy and matted. His eyes burned with something feral, and when that reflection grinned, Brian swore he saw teeth too long, too sharp. "Brian," Stewie said softly, "this isn't a mirror. It's a doorway." The words hung heavy in the air. The house had not just become haunted. It was showing them layers of itself that were never meant to be seen. As they studied the glass, the temperature in the attic dropped suddenly. Their breaths came out in pale streams. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward them, long fingers crawling along the floor, and then came the sound, soft at first, like a whisper carried on wind, but it grew louder, clearer. It was a voice. "Come closer," it beckoned. Stewie's eyes widened with fascination rather than fear. He took a cautious step closer to the mirror. The reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the inside of the glass. The surface rippled, distorting as though begging to be broken. Brian barked sharply, a rare display of fear. "Don't touch it, Stewie!" But the boy was entranced. He raised his hand slowly, inches away from the mirror. The air around them tightened, the weight of the house pressing down as though it were holding its breath. Brian lunged forward and yanked Stewie back at the last second. just before the glass surface bulged outward, like something was about to push through. The mirror cracked. A spider web of fractures spread across its surface, but instead of shattering outward, the cracks glowed faintly like veins of light. The voice grew louder, harsher now, overlapping in a dozen tones. Men, women, children, all speaking at once. You cannot hide from what you are. The attic shook violently. The mirror pulsed, the glow spreading into the floorboards like roots. Stewie, finally shaken, clutched Brian's fur. "We woken it," he muttered. "We woken the house." Brian didn't reply because he knew Stewie was right. The house wasn't just breathing anymore. It was awake. The two scrambled down the attic stairs as the walls around them groaned and splintered. Photographs fell from the hallway walls, their glass shattering across the floor. The distorted faces seemed to grin wider as they passed, as though mocking their panic. The house wasn't trying to keep them trapped. It was leading them somewhere. They stumbled into the basement door without realizing how they got there. The knob twisted on its own, and the door swung open, revealing a staircase descending into blackness. Brian froze. "We don't go down there, Stewie, ever." But the pull was undeniable. The house had guided them to this place for a reason, and Stewie, ever curious, whispered, "This is the root of it, Brian. Whatever this is, it's waiting for us down there." The air that drifted up from the basement was cold and damp, tinged with the metallic scent of rust and something more sinister. As they descended slowly, the light above them dimmed until only shadows remained. The deeper they went, the more the space seemed to distort. The walls were closer, then wider, as if the staircase stretched into some impossible geometry. When they reached the bottom, the basement wasn't the basement anymore. It was a cavern, the ground uneven and damp, the air echoing with faint drips of unseen water. At the far end stood another door, wooden but old, ancient in a way that didn't fit the house at all. Symbols carved into its surface glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Stewie's voice was hushed. "It's not just the house. The house is built on something older, much older." Brian's paws trembled against the ground. "And we're walking straight into it." They exchanged a glance, a shared fear neither wanted to admit aloud. Yet they stepped closer, drawn as though by a force greater than themselves. The door, without their touch, creaked open. And what waited beyond was not meant for human or dog eyes. The night pressed heavier against Quahog, and the silence within the Griffin household deepened after the lingering memories had passed through their walls. Where once there had been bursts of laughter and surreal chaos, now there were echoes of contemplation, a haunting quality that hung in the air. It was as though the house itself was processing everything that had been spoken, every fragment of history and confession that had surfaced across these hidden hours. And now, as the room shifted once more, we found ourselves preparing to unearth the last fragments of this strange and spectral journey, peeling back the final curtain on episode 11. Brian stirred faintly in the hazy corner of the living room, still bathed in that bluish half-glow. His eyes moved, but not entirely with intent, more like the shifting of someone half in reality and half in a dream. Stewie, cross-legged beside him, continued his quiet musings, but even he seemed to sense that the lore had reached a precipice. They had gone so deep into the unexplored corners of Family Guy's world that the line between their own existence and the hidden truths had begun to blur, and it was in that blurring where the final stories awaited them. The creaking sound that came from upstairs was sharper this time. Not the soft footsteps of memory, but something stronger, like a door that had not been opened in years finally yielding to unseen pressure. Stewie tilted his head, his expression caught between curiosity and suspicion. "Do you hear that, Brian? It's almost as though the house itself is inviting us to conclude this saga." Brian didn't respond at first. He only exhaled, his tail twitching slightly. "Maybe it's not just an invitation, Stewie. Maybe it's a reminder that every story has to end whether we want it to or not." And so the two of them moved together once more, up the narrow staircase that seemed somehow taller than it had before, as though it had stretched in anticipation of what lay at the top. Their steps were heavy, echoing against the silence, each one magnified by the dim light spilling from the hallway. And as they arrived at the landing, they saw it. The attic door slightly ajar where no light should have been. Inside the attic, the air was thick with dust. But beneath the layers of forgotten boxes and old furniture, there were traces of something more profound. A record player sat in the corner, though no one could recall ever bringing one into the house. A thin vinyl disc rested on its turntable, the label worn but faintly legible. Griffin, Memories Final. Stewie's hand trembled as he reached for it, his small fingers brushing against the edge. He placed the needle carefully, and as the static cracked to life, voices filled the attic. Not just the voices of Peter, Lois, Chris, Meg, and others, but versions of them that seemed older, softer, reflective. They were recounting events, not in slapstick tones, but in a kind of melancholic honesty, as if these were the stories never meant to be broadcast, but only whispered in quiet moments between the walls. The voices spoke of Peter's doubts when he wasn't the loud, bumbling figure we knew. They spoke of Lois's lonely nights, of Chris's fleeting moments of brilliance hidden beneath clumsy gestures, of Meg's resilience against a world that never seemed to see her clearly. Even Stewie's own voice echoed there, but not the calculating genius, rather the vulnerable child underneath, longing for connection. And Brian, too, spoke from somewhere deep, confessing his fears of being forgotten, of existing as more than just the witty dog. It was overwhelming, almost unbearable, but also strangely beautiful. The attic shimmered faintly as though the voices themselves had shaped the air into a kaleidoscope of memory. And when the record finally clicked to a stop, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full, as though it contained every layer of the Griffins' lives, sealed together in one quiet truth. Brian let out a slow breath. So, this was it. The end of the lore we weren't supposed to hear. Stewie looked up at him, and for once there was no sarcasm, no biting remark, only stillness. Perhaps not the end, Brian. Perhaps just a recognition that endings are only temporary in this world. Tomorrow, chaos will return. But tonight we've heard what lies beneath. They left the attic quietly, closing the door behind them. Downstairs, the house seemed calmer, almost relieved. The strange heaviness of the night lifted little by little, until only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock remained. It was as though Quahog itself had gone back to sleep, satisfied that its secrets had finally been acknowledged, if only in whispers. And so, as the night drew to its quiet close, Brian and Stewie settled back into their places. The living room lamp flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to press against the horizon. But within the Griffin home, there was no rush, no urgency. Just two figures sitting in shared silence, having witnessed the kind of truths that would never make it onto television, but would live forever in the background hum of the world. The story of Family Guy had always been strange, absurd, and chaotic, but hidden within that chaos were moments of haunting beauty, fragments of humanity tucked inside cartoon exaggerations. That was the lore we had uncovered in episode 11. Not just jokes, not just surreal adventures, but the heartbeats beneath them all. And as we close this episode together, let us leave with that thought, that even in the strangest of worlds, the echoes of memory, vulnerability, and truth are what bind us. The voices fade, the night deepens, and the lore rests once again behind closed doors. Until next time.